the last watch of the night, while the world lay suspended between exhaustion and awakening, and the road before him seemed less like a road than a scar cut across the sleeping earth. The rain of the previous days had left the ground dark and heavy, and Karenlik's hooves struck the mud with a dull rhythm that echoed in the silence like a heartbeat too stubborn to stop. Behind him came the chosen riders who had survived the forest assault, men blackened by smoke, cloaks stiff with dried rain and blood, their faces gaunt with the kind of weariness that settles not only in the muscles but in the soul. They had broken an army, burned a lifeline, and scattered a campaign before it could become a siege. Yet victory did not ride with laughter among them. It rode with silence. It rode with memory. It rode with the names of the dead. The stars had begun to fade, not because dawn had yet fully arrived, but because a pale mist was rising from the hollows and valleys, swallowing the lower world in a ghostly veil. Olive trees emerged from that mist like bent old men standing sentinel over forgotten graves. Low stone walls appeared and vanished. The black skeletons of burnt watchfires marked places where shepherds had slept or scouts had hidden. Orhan kept his eyes forward, but his mind did not remain on the road. It moved ahead of him and behind him, to Bursa, to the palace, to the court, to the men who smiled while calculating betrayal, to the women who bore kingdoms quietly behind their eyes, to the sea where hostile sails would one day return, and to the forest where Yakid's body had cooled upon the soil after all his treachery had finally found its measure. He could still hear Yakid's voice if he allowed himself to, the bitterness in it, the accusation, the way evil often tried, even in its final breath, to clothe itself in the language of justice. Orhan had seen enough of men to know that treachery never considered itself treachery. Every traitor invented a wound. Every betrayer declared himself the betrayed. That was the poison at the center of power. Not merely ambition, but the lie with which ambition justified itself. He had not been born blind to it. He had grown among it. He had watched it move through noble houses and tribal councils and imperial courts. He had seen men wrapped in silk and men wrapped in wool become the same creature once greed entered their chest. Yakid was dead. Daphne was dead, yet the thing that had made them what they were still lived in the world. It always would. As the sky slowly whitened, they reached the ridge from which Bursa could first be seen. Orhan reined in his horse and halted there, and all the riders behind him halted too, some lifting their heads with effort, others blinking through sleepless eyes toward the distant city. Bursa lay beneath the morning haze like a prayer written upon the land. Its domes and minarets rose through the mist. Thin streams of smoke climbed from countless hearths. The outer walls caught the first color of dawn and turned faintly gold. There was no trumpet, no grand procession, no theatrical return, only the sight of home after too much blood and too much distance. For a long moment no one spoke. Then one of the older riders behind him, a man whose beard had gone almost entirely white in Orhan's service, exhaled and whispered praise to Allah under his breath. Orhan did not smile, but something in his face softened. He looked at Bursa not as a conqueror looks at a possession, but as a guardian looks at something entrusted to him by God and by the dead. Every roof below sheltered lives that did not know how close danger had come. Every alley held children who would grow into the next age. Every workshop, every stable, every courtyard, every prayer niche and every humble home was part of the reason he had sharpened steel and led men into ambushes. Power had no meaning outside protection. Rule had no meaning outside responsibility. If a throne existed only to feed itself, then it deserved to burn. It descended the ridge and passed through the outer settlements where farmers were already beginning their day. A woman carrying water looked up and froze when she recognized the standard among the riders. A boy dropped the bundle of wood in his arms and stared wide-eyed. Then voices spread ahead of them like birds taking wing. The Sultan has returned. Orhan Sahib has returned. Doors opened. Men came out into the lanes. Women pulled their veils closer and stood in thresholds with shining eyes. Some bowed their heads. Some raised trembling hands in prayer. A few of the children, too young to understand the gravity but old enough to feel the electric change in the air, began to run after the horses, laughing and shouting his name. Orhan acknowledged them with a lowered hand and a grave nod, but he kept the pace steady and did not allow the column to break. Triumph had its place, yet he could not bear too much noise upon the heels of battle. Still, the city itself could not help but breathe easier as he entered it. Markets that had opened cautiously under the shadow of war seemed suddenly to awaken. Shopkeepers stepped from their stalls. Porters straightened. Guards at the gates struck the hafts of their spears to the ground in salute. By the time Orhan reached the inner quarter, word had outrun him, and the palace guards were already kneeling as the great doors opened. Inside the palace, everything seemed at once familiar and distant, as if he were re-entering a life that had continued without him but had also been holding its breath. Servants moved quickly yet quietly. Courtyard fountains sang their thin silver songs. The polished stone underfoot reflected the gray morning light. But beneath the order and ceremony, beneath the fragrance of rosewater and cedar and clean linen, Orhan could sense the same thing he always sensed after a campaign: relief wrapped around tension. Victories did not end danger. They merely changed its shape. Malhan Hatun was the first of the household to meet him in the inner court. She did not rush toward him like a mother in a lesser house might have done, because she was who she was, because dignity had been forged into her bones through trial and throne and loss. But her eyes gave her away before any word did. She took 2 steps forward, placed both hands upon his shoulders, and studied his face as if reading not only whether he was wounded but what battle had carved upon his spirit this time. Orhan bowed his head slightly and kissed her hand. She told him that praise be to Allah for returning him safely, and there was a tremor deep in the strength of her voice that only those who knew her truly would have heard. He replied that Allah's mercy had carried them through, and that the realm stood safe for now. For now, she repeated, because she too understood that these words were never spoken lightly. Then Nilofer came. She did not run, she did not cry out. She walked with measured steps into the courtyard, and yet every person present could feel the force of the moment as sharply as if the sky had split open. The morning light touched the edge of her veil and rested there. Her face had changed since he last saw it. Not in beauty, for she was no less beautiful than before, but in composure. The uncertainty that had once shadowed her gaze had been tempered. There was greater steadiness in her now, as though responsibility had entered her and found its rightful shape. She stopped a few paces away. Orhan looked at her, and for a brief instant all the palace, all the campaign, all the dust and blood and command and burden seemed to recede. No one else could have known the 1,000 unsaid things that passed in that silence. The fear carried through sleepless nights. The prayers spoken in separate rooms beneath separate roofs. The memory of hands that had parted with too much left unresolved. The dread that one letter might come instead of a man. The knowledge that one life was tied to another in ways that could no longer be denied even if the world demanded silence. At last she bowed her head and he stepped closer. His voice when he greeted her was calm, almost formal to any outer ear, and yet under it was a warmth that those nearest felt without understanding. She answered that the palace had awaited his return, but what she meant was far greater than the walls around them. He asked after matters within the city, and she answered with clarity, reporting stores, petitions, disputes among merchants, concerns from outlying districts, and the condition of the treasury allotments sent to widows of the recent dead. Orhan listened with attention, and while others might have thought this a cold exchange between ruler and consort, he understood exactly what she was doing. She was telling him that she had not merely waited. She had stood. She had held. She had carried the part of the world placed into her hands. And in doing so she had met him where he lived now, not in softness alone, but in duty. He thanked her, their eyes met again, that was all, yet it was enough. After that he went directly to the council chamber, because a ruler who rests before securing his victory invites defeat to enter by a side door. There he found Turhan, Shamal Kara Kalo, several senior beys, the chief scribe, and the keeper of the military seals already assembled around the long table. Maps lay spread out. Wax tablets bore fresh marks. A brazier burned in the corner, and above it incense coiled toward the ceiling like an unanswered question. Orhan entered, and every man rose. He gave no lengthy ceremony. Sit, he said, and they sat. The reports began at once. The enemy army broken at the basin had disintegrated into scattered remnants. Some had fled westward in small groups and were being hunted by local detachments. Others had thrown down their weapons and begged quarter. A few officers of rank had vanished and were suspected to be trying to reach coastal positions in hopes that the fleet under Demir Khan might still make landfall and salvage some fragment of the campaign. Shamal proposed dispatching fast riders to every harbor and inlet within striking range. No ship must be allowed to disembark troops unchallenged. Turhan argued that the greater danger now lay not in the shattered land force, but in the possibility of panic among allied tribes who had been quietly observing which way fortune would turn. If they believed imperial retaliation inevitable, they might hedge, delay, withhold support, or worse, open channels to the enemy. Victory on the field had to become certainty in the political mind before rumor could dilute it. Orhan listened, hands resting on the edge of the table, eyes lowered to the maps, his silence pressing the room into deeper seriousness. Then he began to speak, and as always when he did after battle, his words came not in rushes but in measured blows, each one placed exactly where it needed to land. Riders would go not only to the harbors but to every tribal encampment and regional market town carrying the same message. The invading force had been broken, its supply line burned, its commanders disgraced, and the roads of the highlands remained in Ottoman hands. Every account must be precise, not boastful. Exaggeration breeds doubt. Truth breeds fear in enemies and confidence in allies. Captured soldiers of lesser rank who laid down their arms willingly would be disarmed, marked, and released in select directions so that the story of defeat would spread by their own mouths. Officers of strategic value would be held. Scouts must watch the coast continuously. If Demir Khan's fleet attempted landing, signal pyres would be lit from promontory to promontory, and cavalry would move before the anchors fully dropped. Then his finger moved upon the map to Karasi. The harbor there, he said, remained the throat through which the emperor hoped to breathe life back into this failed campaign. That throat must be closed. Not by reckless assault if the fleet was already under heavy guard, but by intelligence, fire, and confusion. He wanted the ships burned before they sailed if possible, but if not, then crippled before they coordinated with any land force. Turhan suggested sending a small disguised contingent through traders and dock laborers. Kara Khalil offered names of seamen loyal to the Beylik who knew the tides and could navigate under moonless skies. Shamal proposed a second layer. False information seeded among imperial intermediaries that the road inland had become impassable due to landslides and partisan attack. If the fleet delayed while verifying the claim, precious days would be won. Orhan approved all 3 lines of action. That was how empires were resisted, not by sword alone, but by making the enemy doubt his timing, waste his strength, mistrust his own channels, and arrive late to a battlefield that no longer existed as he imagined it. The council pressed on into details: supply distribution to the garrisons, burial rites for the fallen, rewards to families, rotation of exhausted troops, repair of mountain paths damaged during the ambush, inspection of arsenals, and the political theater necessary after every military success. Letters must go to friendly rulers. Gifts must be sent where gratitude needed strengthening. Warnings must be sent where ambition needed cooling. At length the chief scribe unrolled a separate parchment and cleared his throat. There remained, he said carefully, a matter concerning the Shahanshah. The room changed. Shoulders tightened. Even the brazier seemed to crackle more sharply. The Shahanshah had not openly declared himself against Orhan, not in the absolute naked way of Yakid or Daphne, yet his shadow lay across too many intrigues, too many whispered contacts, too many moments of hesitation where loyalty should have been instant. His fear of Orhan, his hunger, his wounds from old comparisons with Osman's legacy, all had made him fertile ground for manipulation. The latest intelligence suggested that after the disaster in the highlands, he had grown deeply unsettled. Andreas was said to be pressing him harder, urging him that delay meant weakness, and that the throne he coveted would vanish forever if he did not move decisively soon. Orhan asked what proof they had. The scribe gestured to sealed notes recovered from a courier intercepted near a monastery road. The contents were not complete but sufficient to show contact between Andreas's circle and men associated with the Shahanshah's household. Not enough for a public accusation, enough for private certainty. Turhan cursed softly under his breath. Shamal's face hardened into stone. Kara Khalil warned that half-proven treason was the most dangerous kind because if struck poorly it creates martyrs, and if ignored it grows teeth. Orhan took the letters, read them in silence, then folded them once and placed them back upon the table. The Shahanshah, he said, is not Yakid. Men like Yakid rot from their core, men like Shahanshah fracture. A fractured man can become a traitor or he can become a warning to himself. We will not drive him fully into Andreas's arms by moving too soon. Watch him. Narrow the roads around him. Remove uncertain men from posts near his communications. Give him room enough to reveal himself further but not enough to strike. If he is salvageable, we salvage him. If he crosses the line, then he will answer before God and men alike. This answer did not satisfy every man in the room, but none challenged it. They knew Orhan's way. He was not soft, he was precise. There was a difference and only fools failed to see it. When the council broke, the sun had climbed high and the palace had fully awakened. Petitioners waited in outer halls. Captains requested signatures. Quartermasters sought authorizations. 2 village elders had come regarding a water dispute. A widow demanded justice against a local official who had stolen the stipend meant for her dead husband's household. A caravan master requested armed escort through a forest route where displaced enemy remnants had been seen. Orhan could have postponed these matters, citing fatigue and campaign return, and no one would have dared object. Yet he heard them, one after another. He gave orders, questioned witnesses, corrected records, and made it plain that a battlefield victory meant nothing if injustice was permitted to nest within his own house. Those who watched him that day saw what many rulers never grasped. the realm is not defended only where spears cross. It is defended wherever power chooses fairness over convenience. By late afternoon, exhaustion had begun to settle into him with a heaviness he could not fully hide. The body that battle had carried on heat and will now demanded its due. Still he refused rest until one final matter was attended. He asked to see Esporcha. She was found not in a perfumed chamber or idle company, but in the training courtyard beyond the inner gardens where a low wall screened the space from the more ceremonial parts of the palace. She stood with a practice blade in hand, facing a post wrapped in leather and rope, striking again and again with disciplined fury. Sweat darkened the fabric at her neck. Her breathing was hard but controlled. Each cut was clean, each recovery exact. She heard the footsteps before the guard announced him and turned sharply. For a heartbeat the warrior remained in her face. Then the woman returned. "You came back," she said. "I gave you my word," he answered. That was enough to break the hardness in her gaze. She lowered the practice blade, and for a moment all the practice composure, all the self-command she had been rebuilding within herself since he left, seemed to falter. She crossed the distance between them more quickly than ceremony allowed and stopped just short, as if the last step required a permission she was not certain she possessed. Orhan gave it without words. He reached for her. She came into his arms with a force restrained only by the walls around them, and for several breaths neither spoke. When at last they parted, she studied his face, then his shoulders, his forearms, looking for injury with the sharpness of someone who knew how often men lied about wounds. He told her he was whole. She told him she had heard enough stories of whole men dying 3 days later from what they dismissed. He almost laughed then, and the almost laugh itself seemed to surprise them both. She asked what had happened in the mountains, and he told her, not as he had told the council with lines and objectives, but as one warrior tells another. The rain, the narrow path, the smell of wet bark and mule grease from the wagons, the timing, the horn in the dark, the close fight among burning carts, Kemal's shoulder wound, the way Shamal arrived at precisely the edge between survival and ruin. Esporcha listened without interruption, and as she listened her face shifted through tension, anger, admiration, fear, and something deeper than all of them. The pain of imagining a beloved person standing in a place where one could not reach. When he finished, she was silent a long time. Then she said that each time he walked into danger, something inside her rebelled against the part of her that understood duty. She had spent years training herself to be ruled by reason, by endurance, by necessity. Yet now she hated the necessity. He answered that he hated it too, more than she knew. But hatred changed nothing. The world did not stop requiring hard men to stand between it and those who would consume it. She said she knew. That was what made it unbearable. If the danger were foolish, she could rage against it. But because it was necessary, because it was right, she could only bear it and bleed quietly. Orhan looked at her, really looked, and in that moment he understood again why she had become dangerous not to him, but to the solitude in which he had lived so long. She saw too much. She named too much. With others he could be sultan, commander, son of legacy, iron hand. With her he had to be a man. There was no armor for that. He asked whether she still feared what Daphne had tried to poison. Esporcha's expression darkened. Daphne's words, she said, had not vanished with her death. Venom lingers, yet she had chosen not to let a dead woman keep governing her heart. If Nilüfer harbored pain, then that pain would have to be faced with honesty, not suspicion. If the palace looked at her and saw only the shadow of another woman, then she would endure that too. She was tired of living by the shape of other people's fears. Orhan said quietly that a day would come when she would no longer stand in anyone's shadow. She searched his face as if trying to see whether he spoke comfort or truth. What she found there stilled her. Their moment ended when a young page came breathless through the archway and dropped to one knee. A rider had arrived from the coast, urgent, bearing the seal of Faladios. The name itself shifted the air. Faladios was not a man who sent messages without reason. He moved between worlds, between docks and courts, between merchant houses and armed crews, a figure useful precisely because he was difficult to place fully inside any one power. He had contacts in the islands, in border taverns, among Greek pilots, Armenian traders, Turkoman drovers, and monks who heard confessions from men who should never have spoken aloud. If he wrote urgently, then the sea was moving. Orhan went at once to the receiving chamber. The rider had collapsed from fatigue and salt wind. His horse stood outside white with foam. The sealed tube was brought. Orhan broke it and read. As he read, his eyes narrowed and then sharpened. Faladios reported that Demir Khan's fleet had not sailed in full strength as expected. Instead, part of it had held back. while a smaller but faster group of vessels had slipped out under cloud cover and headed not directly toward the obvious harbors, but southward first, using coastal misdirection before turning. Their likely target, according to pilots who had overheard coded orders, was not merely reinforcement of surviving land troops. It was seizure. They intended to strike at a lesser-defended coastal stronghold, whose harbor controlled provisioning routes between inland settlements and the maritime road. If taken quickly, even temporarily, it could become a knife against Bursa's flank and a staging point for further infiltration. Palladios believed the target to be the fortress near the inlets below Eskihisar. Tarhan was summoned again, Shamil too. Within the hour the council table was spread anew. Men who had barely removed their campaign gear found themselves bent once more over map and rumor and tide chart. This was how the enemy survived defeat, by refusing to mourn it. This was how Orhan had survived too. There would be no sleep yet. Palladios' intelligence was weighed against known shipping speeds, winds, current patterns, and the last sightings from coastal watch stations. Kara Khalil, who understood maritime logistics better than any court-born noble ever could, traced possible routes with stained fingers, and said the report fit. A fast strike by sea against a secondary stronghold was exactly the sort of move an embarrassed commander would make if he needed a symbolic foothold after disaster inland. It would not restore the campaign, but it could restore morale, stir allies, and force Orhan to disperse already strained forces. In war, symbols often bled as much as armies. Orhan made his decision swiftly. The exhausted main body would not be marched blindly into another attritional rush. Instead, a split response. Shamil would take fast cavalry and move overland toward the approaches to Eskihisar, securing inland roads and preventing any enemy landing force from expanding beyond the harbor. Kara Khalil would assemble rivercraft, fishing vessels, and every armed coastal boat available under trusted captains to harass the incoming ships, especially at night. Fireships would be prepared. Tar, pitch, oil, and dry reeds would be gathered by dusk. Orhan himself would depart with a compact corps of seasoned fighters and engineers to reinforce the fortress directly before the enemy could establish batteries on the shore. Tarhan objected that this meant Orhan would again place himself at the point of greatest danger. Orhan replied that the point of greatest danger was where the enemy hoped leadership would be absent. If the defenders saw his banner on the wall before the masts appeared, they would hold like lions. If the enemy heard he was there, uncertainty would enter their ranks. Presence itself was a weapon. He would use it. Before leaving, however, he went first to the mosque within the palace quarter. Not because he needed spectacle, not because rulers are improved by being seen in prayer, but because the soul that is not washed after too much blood begins to harden in ways that no victory can justify. He stood in the dim, cool space beneath the lamps, shoulder to shoulder with men far lower than him in station and no lower than him before God, and he bowed his head to the ground. In that bowed silence past the dead, the living, the fearful, the proud, the wounded, the hopeful, he asked for steadiness, not triumph. Steadiness, triumph belongs to Allah. Steadiness is what men beg for when they know what they are. When he emerged, evening had deepened. The palace lanterns had been lit. The courtyard pools reflected crescent flames. There was a new urgency in the air now, a tightening across all levels of the household. Armorers carried bundles. Scribes ran with sealed packets. Stable boys hurried under shouted orders. Somewhere in the inner hall, a woman was singing softly to calm a child who had sensed fear without understanding it. Orhan paused only briefly in the passage where Nilüfer met him. She knew from his face that he was leaving again before anyone told her. There was no reproach in her expression, only the tired pain of one who has just barely exhaled and must at once hold breath again. The coast, she asked. He said yes. Palladios had sent warning. The enemy would try a wound through the sea. She nodded once, absorbing the blow, then asked what the city required while he was gone. That was her way, not to clutch at him first, but to take hold of the work. He told her, secure grain movement, keep watch over merchants with imperial ties, have the Friday sermon include mention of the mountain victory but without triumphal excess, and ensure stipends to wounded soldiers. Households are delivered before the week ends. Fear grows faster where justice arrives late. She said it would be done. Only then did the private quiet come between them. She told him she had just begun to believe he was truly back. He answered that a ruler returns in pieces. One part arrives home, another is already being called elsewhere. It was a bitter truth, and he did not soften it. She stepped closer and said, then let at least one part of you remember where to come back to. He looked at her as though storing the image. I do, he said, always. Elsewhere in the palace, a sporcher received the same news with less stillness and more visible flame. She sought him near the armory gallery, anger and fear braided so tightly that for a moment she could not separate them. Must it always be you, she asked. Must every spear point in the world find your path? He answered with more weariness than defiance that he did not choose the age he lived in. She said no, but he chose every time to stand at its sharpest edge. He did not deny it. How could he? She turned away, fighting for composure, then faced him again and said if he would not step back from danger, then he must promise one thing, that if the wall can hold without him exposing himself pointlessly, he will let it hold. He said he promised to spend his life where it mattered, not where vanity called it. That answer, because it was the truest he could give, was accepted. Night had fully fallen by the time the departure horn sounded low through the palace yard. No grand send-off gathered this time. Too many had not yet even washed the dust of the previous return from their garments. Orhan mounted beneath torchlight. The flame reflections moved over his armor in restless waves. Shamel's riders were already departing by the land road. Kara Khalil had gone ahead to the docks. The compact force assigned to Orhan gathered around him with that grim, practiced efficiency of men who knew sleep could be postponed, but not relied upon. As they rode out through Bursa once more, the city was different than it had been that morning. Quieter, lamps in windows, doors barred, night watch calls moving from quarter to quarter, yet even now people sensed movement. Curtains shifted, faces appeared at lattice screens. A few voices whispered blessings into the dark as the riders passed. Beyond the city walls the night opened vast and cold. A salt wind had begun to travel inland, faint but unmistakable. The sea was calling the next struggle toward itself. They rode first through orchards black under moonlight, then along a ridge road where the land dropped away to marsh and reed bed, and farther on into pine woods where the earth gave off the smell of resin and rain-soaked needles. Torches were kept hooded when needed and extinguished when not. Scouts ranged ahead. More than once they paused while one of the outriders returned with news of track marks, fisher paths, or strangers seen near abandoned shrines. Every fragment mattered. This was no longer the broad violence of army against army. This was the knife work between campaign beats, where forts changed hands by surprise, where harbors were lost by an hour's delay, where the wrong beacon lit in the wrong order could invite catastrophe. Near midnight they reached a hill from which the dark mass of the coast could be glimpsed under the stars. There the horizon was a deeper black than the land, and across it, if one looked long enough, one could see tiny, unstable pricks of distant light. Ships, not many, but enough. Palladios was waiting below with 3 men and a lantern screened in blue cloth. He emerged from the shadows as if the night itself had produced him. Sea salt crusted his beard. His cloak smelled of tar and wet rope. He bowed just enough to honor the station before him and then got to the point, because that too was why Orhan valued him. The lead vessels had been sighted altering course twice. They were moving carefully, trying not to announce the target too early. 2 light galleys had already dispatched small boats toward the coves. Demir Khan was not aboard the lead element, which meant this was a probing strike under a subordinate commander eager for a quick success. Dangerous, Palladios said, because ambitious subcommanders often gamble hardest. Orhan asked the fortress condition. Palladios replied that the garrison was loyal but under strength. The walls were sound on the landward face but weaker toward the old sea steps where storms had eaten mortar from the lower stones. The harbor chain existed but needed full raising and locking. Powder stores were limited. Water good. Morale uncertain because rumors had outrun orders and some feared the main army had not truly won inland after all. Orhan nodded. Then the first battle there would not be with arrows, it would be with certainty. They descended toward the fortress before dawn. As they approached, the sea became louder, waves thudding against rock like the pulse of some great sleeping beast. The stronghold rose from the shoreline on a blunt shelf of stone, its walls pale in the starlight, its watchtower lantern dim. Men upon the battlements called challenge. Orhan gave answer. At first there was disbelief, then astonishment. Then the gate mechanisms jolted into movement and the fortress opened to him. He entered without ceremony, and at once ordered the harbor chain inspected. Tar cauldrons heated, spare stones brought to vulnerable parapets, archers distributed by angle not by habit, and the weaker sea steps blocked with timber and rubble. He had the garrison assembled in the lower court while the sky was still dark enough that faces appeared as clusters of shadow beneath torch glow. Men came in patched mail, worn helmets, sea cloaks, and rough boots still damp from night watch. They expected orders, some expected rebuke. Instead they saw Orhan himself standing before them with campaign dust still on him from the mountains. He told them what had happened inland. Not in boasting terms, in hard facts. The enemy army had been broken. Their supplies burned, their dead lay in the basin and their prisoners had carried word back in humiliation. The ships coming now were not the spear of a victorious empire. They were the fingers of a drowning hand reaching for purchase. If those fingers found stone here, they would cling. If they were cut off here, they would sink. This fortress, he said, is not a forgotten edge. It is the hinge of the coast. Hold it today, and we hold the line from mountain to sea. Lose it, and every liar in every market will say the Ottomans win on land but bleed at water. Choose what story the dawn will carry. Something changed in the men as he spoke. Weariness straightened. Eyes lifted. Hands tightened around spear shafts, not in fear now but in ownership. This was what he meant when he said presence is a weapon. The same walls, the same stones, the same number of defenders, and yet after a leader speaks truly into the heart of danger, an entire fortress becomes a different organism. Then the horizon began to pale. At first the sea remained only a dark breadth under gray sky. Then light seeped upward in cold layers. The outlines of waves sharpened. Gulls began to wheel and cry. And there, far enough to still seem unreal yet near enough to turn every chest tighter, the silhouettes of ships emerged one by one from the dawn mist. Long, low, purposeful, oars flashing faintly. Sails furled for controlled approach. Not merchants, not fishermen, war. Orhan stood upon the seaward wall between two crenellations worn smooth by generations of wind and brine. Beside him stood Faladios, Shamel's messenger captain, the fortress commander, and two young archers trying not to show how hard they were swallowing. Below, men rushed to stations. The harbor chain creaked upward from the water like some rusted sea serpent rising from sleep. Pitch fires thickened the air with smoke. The tide pressed in against the rocks. The lead galley altered angles slightly, testing depth and current. Another widened left, perhaps seeking the old sea steps Faladios had mentioned. Small boats were being lowered. The enemy hoped for speed, confusion, and terror before the fortress could fully organize. Instead, they found banners already raised, archers already sighting, cauldrons already steaming, and on the wall, unmistakable even at distance, the figure of Orhan Saheb. Faladios glanced at him and murmured that the sight alone would reach their decks before the arrows did. Orhan did not answer. He watched the ships the way a hunter watches wolves, deciding whether the fold is truly guarded. Then the first horn sounded from the enemy galley, low and brazen across the morning water. Orhan lifted his hand. Every sound on the wall seemed to narrow around that single motion. Bows bent, men leaned forward, oil crackled, the gulls screamed above. Dawn spread whiter over steel, smoke, stone, and sea. And as the first enemy boats began pulling hard toward the shore, the next chapter of fire and iron opened beneath the whitening sky. The road carried Orhan Saheb forward through the night as if the earth itself had sworn an oath to deliver him to the next turning of fate. The hooves of Karenlik struck damp soil and scattered stones, and each sound was swallowed by the forest that lined the path, black trunks rising like pillars, branches interlocking overhead to form a roof of shadow where even moonlight struggled to breathe. The battle at Juljaha had ended in fire and ruin behind him, but the scent of it still clung to his clothes. Smoke, scorched hay, hot iron, and that sharp metallic bitterness of blood that never truly left a warrior's hands no matter how many times he washed them. Victory had been won, yes, but victory was never clean. It came with ash under the fingernails and names carved into the heart. Behind him rode a small escort, silent, disciplined, their cloaks drawn tight against the chill. They did not speak because they did not need to. In the Ottoman camps, men learned early that words were expensive, and in nights like these, silence was the only currency worth keeping. Orhan's mind did not rest. It returned again and again to the same images: wagons burning like floating coffins of flame, enemy soldiers stumbling through smoke, Shamel's cavalry hammering into the reserve force, the instant when steel met steel and the world shrank to a narrow corridor of survival. But another image kept returning too, softer, more dangerous in its own way. Asporcha's face in moonlight, her tear catching the silver of the sky, her voice steady as she forced herself to be strong. It was easier to carry a sword into battle than it was to carry a promise into a war that had no end. He had told her he would return. He had made it sound like certainty. Yet every road, every tree, every gust of wind reminded him that certainty was the one thing no man could own. Hours passed. The forest thinned. The black line of trees broke apart into rolling hills, and beyond those hills the first faint suggestion of Bursa's lands began to reveal itself, a darker darkness on the horizon where the city's silhouette lay like a beast curled in sleep. Somewhere ahead, riders would have already carried the news of Juljaha to the palace. Somewhere ahead, Nilüfer would be reading his letter again and again until the paper softened at the folds. Somewhere ahead, Malhatan would be whispering prayers for his safe arrival, while outwardly commanding the palace with the calm of a woman forged in hardship. Orhan felt the pull of home like a tide, yet he also felt the pull of something else, an unease that moved beneath his skin, the instinct that had saved his life 100 times. The road was too quiet, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of something holding its breath. He raised his fist without turning his head. The escort slowed immediately, horses stepping carefully now, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Orhan's gaze swept the ridges on either side of the road. In moonlight, a man could mistake a boulder for a crouched soldier. In moonlight, a shadow could be an ambush waiting to unfold. A bird cried out suddenly from the left slope, a sharp, startled sound. Orhan did not relax. Birds screamed when something disturbed them. He listened harder. The wind shifted and brought with it a faint smell, oil. Not lamp oil from a home, not the gentle smell of cooked food, but the thick, rancid oil used to slick leather and to feed fire fast. He did not draw his sword yet. Drawing too early could be the spark that lit the trap. Instead, he leaned slightly forward in his saddle, his voice low enough that only the men closest to him could hear. Spread, he murmured, 2 to each flank. Watch the ridge line, no torches. If you see movement, do not shout. Whistle once. They moved as he ordered, melting off the road into the darkness like disciplined ghosts. Orhan continued forward, alone at the center, as if he were merely a rider on a quiet road. He made himself appear careless. This was a trick as old as war, bait must not look like bait. He let his posture loosen. He allowed Karanlik's pace to remain steady, but inside his body was a drawn bow. The road dipped between 2 low hills, forming a shallow corridor. The slopes on both sides were covered with scrub, rocks, and sparse trees, perfect cover for archers and spearmen. Orhan's eyes caught a faint gleam high on the right slope, a blink of light, then gone. Metal, glass, a blade catching moonlight. A single whistle cut the air, short and sharp. Orhan did not need any more confirmation. He kicked Karanlik forward, not into a gallop, not yet, but into a swift, controlled surge. At the same instant, the night erupted. Arrows hissed out of the darkness, a volley loosed too early by impatient hands. 2 struck the road in front of him, splintering, 1 struck the rear of his saddle, and another buried itself in the flank of a horse behind him. The animal screamed and reared, and in that scream the ambush revealed its true size. Dozens of men surging down the slopes with spears and short swords, their faces hidden by scarves, their breath visible in the cold air. Orhan drew his sword in one fluid motion, the steel sliding free with a sound that seemed to wake the world. Karanlik lunged forward and Orhan met the first attacker head-on. The man swung wildly, desperate, and Orhan cut across his chest with a single controlled strike, not stopping to watch him fall. Another came from the left, thrusting a spear at the horse's neck. Orhan leaned down and hacked the spear shaft in 2, then drove the point of his blade up under the attacker's jaw. Blood sprayed dark in the moonlight, and Orhan's horse surged through the gap. Behind him, his escort reacted with brutal precision. They had been trained for this, a kill box, a corridor ambush. 2 riders on the left flank charged up the slope, forcing the archers to scatter, while 2 on the right dismounted and used their shields to form a moving wall, pushing toward the narrow point where the attackers were densest. Steel rang, men shouted, horses screamed. The quiet road became a furnace of violence. Orhan's mind, even in combat, remained strategic. This was not random banditry. These attackers were too coordinated, too disciplined, too well-equipped. And they had chosen this place, this corridor, where numbers could overwhelm a smaller group. Someone had planned this. Someone had known his route. That thought struck harder than any blade. Betrayal whispered the darkest part of his mind. Someone talks, someone listens, someone sells information. He cut down another attacker, then wheeled Karanlik around to look back and assess. His men were holding, but the ambushers were still pouring in from the slopes. More arrows came down, less accurate now because their own men were in the way. That meant desperation. That meant the attackers were willing to kill their own to kill him. Orhan saw the leader then, not by a crown or banner but by posture. A man standing higher up the right slope, not rushing into the melee, issuing signals with his hand. He wore a dark cloak and a helmet without ornament, but he held himself like command. Orhan pointed his sword. With me, he growled to the 2 nearest riders. They followed without question. They drove up the slope through brush and loose stones. An archer stepped out, aiming at Orhan's chest. Orhan lifted his shield just in time. The arrow struck and stuck, vibrating. He slammed the shield into the archer's face and heard bone crack. The second rider skewered another man with his spear. The third rider took a blade across his arm and nearly fell, but he held on, gritting his teeth. Orhan's horse reached the leader's level. The leader finally drew his own sword, but his eyes widened slightly as if he had not expected Orhan to come for him personally. That was always the mistake of men who hunted lions. They believed the lion would run like a deer. The two men collided in close combat, blades meeting in a burst of sparks. The leader was skilled. He parried cleanly, stepped to the side, tried to angle for Orhan's ribs. Orhan pivoted, using Karanlik's bulk to block the strike, then countered with a downward cut aimed at the leader's forearm. The leader twisted, avoiding it by a hair, then drove forward, trying to force Orhan off balance on the unstable slope. For a few heartbeats, the world narrowed to steel, breath, and the grind of boots on wet earth. Orhan saw the leader's technique trained, not a peasant's flailing. A soldier, a mercenary, or one of Andreas's hidden knives. Orhan fainted high, then struck low, sweeping the leader's leg. The leader stumbled. Orhan did not waste the opening. He drove his pommel into the man's face, hard, snapping his head back. The leader fell to one knee. Orhan pressed the sword to his throat. "Who sent you?" Orhan hissed. The leader's breath came in ragged bursts. Even then he tried to smile. "Too late, Sultan," he rasped, "too late." Orhan's instinct screamed. Too late for what? He glanced down the slope and he saw it, oil-soaked bundles placed along the road below, hidden beneath brush, now being lit by men with torches. Fire crawled along the ground like a living thing, racing toward the corridor where Orhan's escort still fought. They weren't trying only to kill him. They were trying to burn him, to trap him in smoke and flame where blades meant nothing. Orhan drove his sword forward. The leader's eyes went glassy, his body sagging. Orhan did not look back. He kicked Karanlik down the slope, shouting for his men to break through, to move, to retreat out of the corridor before the fire sealed it shut. His riders heard him and reacted instantly, abandoning the urge to finish the fight, focusing instead on survival and extraction, the difference between warriors and fools. The fire reached the road. Flames climbed dry brush. Smoke rose thick and black, rolling into lungs, into eyes, into the mind. Men coughed, horses panicked. The ambushers, realizing their trap might fail, surged in again to stop the escape. Orhan's escort formed a wedge, shields forward, swords working in tight arcs, cutting and thrusting just enough to create space. Orhan rode at the wedge's tip, the point of the spear, his voice cutting through chaos, ordering, guiding, refusing to let panic take root. A rider fell, dragged from his saddle by 3 attackers. Orhan turned and cut one down, then another, and the third fled. The fallen rider's face was pale under the soot, but his eyes were still alive. Orhan grabbed his collar and hauled him up behind another horseman. The wedge broke free from the corridor just as the fire climbed fully onto both slopes, turning the place into a burning throat. The ambushers retreated, some lost in the smoke, others running into the trees. Their mission failed, but their message delivered. You can be reached. You are not untouchable. Orhan rode hard until the smoke was behind them, until the air was clean again, until the only sound was the panting of horses and the ragged breathing of men who had survived by inches. Only then did he slow. Only then did he allow the anger to rise fully, a slow flood, not explosive but heavy, the kind of anger that does not burn out quickly. Someone knew his route. Someone wanted him dead before he reached Bursa. Someone was moving pieces while he was fighting battles. He turned his horse toward his wounded men. Count, he ordered, names, injuries. They had lost 3, 2 dead, 1 missing, 4 wounded, not disastrous but painful. Every man lost was a crack in the wall that protected the realm. Orhan looked toward the horizon, where Bursa's silhouette still lay distant. The night was not over, and now he knew it would not allow him to travel as if the road belonged to him. It belonged to whoever could take it. He made a decision then, quick and sharp. They would not continue along the main road. They would vanish into the side paths, move through villages, take routes known only to shepherds and woodcutters. And he would send a messenger ahead, one fast rider, to warn the palace that the snake still lived, that the enemy had long arms, that the war was not confined to mountain passes and burning supply trains. A young rider volunteered, eyes steady despite the blood on his cheek. Orhan clasped his shoulder and gave him a short message sealed with his signet ring. "Tell Malhatun," he said. "Tell Nilüfer, tell them to lock the palace, double the guard, watch every servant, every messenger, every trader who enters the gates. And tell them this, the hand that lit fire on my road is not the hand of a simple bandit. It belongs to a mind. The rider nodded once and disappeared into the darkness, spurring his horse toward Bursa as if chased by death. Orhan and the rest turned off the main road, climbing into rougher terrain where the trees grew thick again and the ground became a tangle of roots and stones. The night deepened. The moon slipped behind clouds. Somewhere far away, wolves howled not out of hunger but out of recognition that blood had been spilled and the world had shifted. In the early hours before dawn, they reached a small village nestled between hills, its houses clustered around a modest mosque, its people asleep behind wooden doors. Orhan did not enter openly. He approached quietly, roused the village elder, a man with a white beard and fearful eyes who recognized him instantly and nearly fell to his knees. Orhan stopped him with a raised hand. No ceremony, he murmured. I need shelter for a few hours, water for men and horses, and silence. If you can give me that, your village will be remembered. The elder nodded frantically. He led them to a barn behind his own home, a low structure that smelled of hay and animals. Orhan's men dismounted and tended wounds in the dim light of a covered lantern. Cloth was torn, wounds cleaned with water and alcohol, bandages tightened. A wounded rider bit down on leather as his arm was stitched. No one complained. No one asked why this had happened. The answer was already in their bones: power draws knives. Orhan sat alone for a moment on an upturned crate, his sword across his knees. His hands were steady, but his mind was not. He kept seeing the leader's half-smile and hearing the words, too late for what? He closed his eyes and forced himself to think like his enemies. If I were Andreas, he thought, if I were Shahanshah, what would I do now? I failed to destroy the Ottomans in the basin. Their supply lines are intact. Their morale is high, so I strike the head. I create chaos in Bursa. I poison the palace. I ignite fear among the people. I turn Nilufar against Esporcha against Nilufar, commanders against Orhan. I make the state devour itself. A knock came at the barn door. Kemal entered, his face grim. Sultan, he said, we found something on one of the dead. He held out a small object wrapped in cloth. Orhan unfolded it. A ring, not Ottoman. A stylized emblem carved into the metal, an imperial mark, the kind worn by certain agents loyal to the emperor's shadow network. Not a soldier, not a bandit. A professional knife. Orhan's eyes hardened, so he murmured, the emperor's hand reaches into my roads now. Kemal hesitated, and there is more, Sultan. One of the attackers, before he died, he spoke a name. Orhan looked up slowly. Whose name? Kemal swallowed. Faladios. The name fell into the barn like a stone into water, sending ripples through Orhan's thoughts. Faladios. A man with a history of shifting loyalties, a man who moved between courts like smoke, sometimes a diplomat, sometimes a spy, sometimes something worse. A man who could stand before you smiling while a blade was already sliding toward your back. Orhan stood, the crate scraping against the floor. He felt the world sharpen, as if someone had tightened the strings of a great instrument. Faladios was not a random threat. Faladios meant intrigue. Faladios meant that what was coming was not just war on open fields but war in corridors, whispers, kitchens, and prayer rooms. War where the weapon could be a cup of wine. At first light, Orhan's men moved again, leaving the village before the sun fully rose. They traveled fast, cutting across ridges and fields, avoiding roads, moving like a hunted pack that refused to be cornered. By noon, Bursa was visible, its walls rising strong, banners fluttering, the city alive with motion. But even from a distance, Orhan could sense something was wrong. The gates were too busy. The guard towers too alert. The air had the tension of a bowstring drawn too tight. As they approached, they saw it clearly: extra guards, double patrols, civilians kept back from the gates, men checking wagons and questioning travelers. Malhatan had received the message. The palace was locked down. Orhan rode through the gate without announcement, the guards recognizing him and stepping aside with expressions that mixed relief with fear. Inside the city, the streets buzzed with rumor. People had heard about the mountain battle, yes, but they had also heard something else. Whispers of attempted assassination, whispers of spies, whispers that the emperor's anger had not been extinguished by defeat. Orhan did not go to the palace immediately. He went first to the barracks, to the command post where his city commanders managed security. He demanded reports. Who entered the city in the last week? Which merchants arrived from the coast? Which messengers came from Samandaria? Which faces were new among the guards? The reports were careful, polite, uncertain. Too many names, too many entries, too many opportunities for a serpent to slide in unnoticed. Orhan's patience thinned. He ordered that every gate be watched by his most trusted men, not the usual guards. He ordered that every servant in the palace be questioned. He ordered that the kitchens be locked and that only a small circle of loyal women chosen by Manhattan be allowed to prepare food for the inner chambers. He ordered that the palace wells be guarded. Then and only then did he ride toward the palace. The gates opened. Inside, the courtyard was quieter than usual, the fountain still running but the laughter absent. Even the birds seemed to chirp more softly. Manhattan appeared at the steps, her posture strong, her eyes sharp. She did not rush to him like a mother in a tale. She approached like a commander because she understood better than anyone that love without discipline got people killed. "You are late," she said, and the words held no accusation, only the strain of hours spent managing fear. "There was an ambush on the road," Orhan replied. "Fire and arrows, they knew my route." Manhattan's jaw tightened. "Then they are inside our borders," she said. "Not outside, not at the walls, but inside. I have doubled the guards. I have locked the palace. Nilüfer has remained in her chambers. Isporcha has been moved to the inner quarters under protection." At the mention of Isporcha, Orhan's eyes flickered. And at the mention of Nilüfer, something deeper moved. Two women, two pillars of his life. Two hearts that enemies would try to turn against each other because men like Andreas understood that the easiest way to break a state was to break the house of its ruler. "Where is Nilüfer?" he asked. Manhattan studied him. "In her chamber," she said. "She has been strong, but strength does not mean she does not bleed inside." Orhan nodded once and climbed the steps, leaving his escort behind. Inside the palace, the corridors smelled of incense and stone and a faint undercurrent of fear. Servants kept their eyes down. Guards stood every few paces. The sound of Orhan's boots echoed softly. When he reached Nilüfer's door, he paused. He was a man who had faced armies without flinching, but this required a different courage. War did not frighten him. The possibility of disappointing those who loved him did. He entered. Nilüfer stood near the window as she had before, light falling across her face. She turned, and for a moment her composure cracked. Her eyes filled, but she did not let tears fall. She walked to him slowly, as if afraid he might vanish like a dream if she moved too quickly. Orhan stopped in front of her. He did not speak first. He simply looked at her, taking in the subtle changes, tiredness at the corners of her eyes, tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly before she forced them still. She lifted her chin. "You said you were coming home," she whispered. "I am here," he said. And the words were too small for what they carried. The space between them collapsed. Nilüfer stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, and Orhan's arms wrapped around her as if his body had remembered this shape even in battle. He held her tightly, and for a moment the palace, the guards, the war, all of it faded. There was only breath, heartbeat, the scent of her hair. But peace never lasted long in the house of a sultan. A soft knock, Manhattan's voice from the other side, controlled but urgent. "Orhan, counsel now." Orhan closed his eyes briefly, then released Nilüfer with reluctant gentleness. He looked into her eyes. "I must go," he said, "but I am here, and no one will take me from you." Nilüfer nodded, swallowing the words she wanted to say because she too understood duty. She reached up and touched his cheek, a brief touch like a blessing, and then she stepped back. Orhan left the chamber and moved toward the council room, where Turhan, Shamal, Ebrenos, and other commanders waited, along with Manhattan. The mood in the room was heavy, not celebratory. Victory at Juljaha had not made them careless. If anything, it had made them more alert because the most dangerous enemy was the one who smiled while bleeding. Shamal spoke first. "Sultan," he said, "we received your warning, we tightened the palace, but there is something else. A messenger arrived from the coast last night, from Karasi." Orhan's eyes narrowed. "Speak." Ebrenos answered, his voice grim. "The harbor burned, Sultan, not all of it but enough. 3 ships destroyed, 2 damaged. Our raiders struck early as planned, but there were survivors, and among those survivors a name was heard, Faladios. He was seen boarding a smaller vessel before the fire spread. He escaped." The room went still. Orhan felt the pieces align in his mind like blades sliding into their sheaths. Faladios had been at Karasi. Faladios's agents had ambushed him on the road. Faladios was moving between sea and land, between fleets and palaces. Manhattan leaned forward. "There is more," she said quietly. "This morning, one of my women found a servant in the inner corridor, one of the newer girls. She was carrying a small pouch of powder. Poison. She claimed she did not know what it was, but fear makes fools speak. Under pressure, she said she was paid by a man who called himself a traitor from Samandaria. Orhan's gaze hardened. Andreas, he murmured, not just Falladio's, Andreas's web. Turhan slammed his fist on the table. Then let us cut the web, he growled. Let us ride to Samandaria and tear Andreas out by the throat. Orhan held up a hand. Not yet, he said. Anger is what they want. If we ride blindly, we fall into traps. We will do what they do best. We will use patience. We will make them think we are afraid. We will let them move. And then we will close the circle. He stood and walked to the map on the wall, drawing the commander's attention. He traced routes with his finger, Bursa to the coast to Samandaria, Samandaria to the inland passes. He spoke like a man building a machine out of terrain and time. They want chaos in Bursa, he said. They want my house divided. They want to poison the heart of the state. So we will harden Bursa like iron. Then we will offer them something they cannot refuse, a false weakness. Shamel's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. A bait, he said. Yes, Orhan replied. A message will be sent when they will intercept. It will say that the Sultan is leaving Bursa with a small escort to visit the wounded at a nearby lodge. We will make it believable. We will make it soft. And when they strike, we will not merely survive. We will capture one of their heads alive. Alive, he repeated, his voice colder. I want answers. I want names. I want the route Faladios uses to move between courts. Ebrenos nodded slowly. That means you will place yourself in danger again, Sultan. Orhan looked at him. I am already in danger, he said. In Bursa, in the palace, on the road, in my bed. The only difference is whether I choose the ground where the blade will come. Malhatan's eyes held his. Then choose carefully, she said, because this time they are not aiming only for your body, they are aiming for your legacy. Orhan's jaw tightened. Then they will find that my legacy has teeth, he said. The plan began immediately. The palace outwardly relaxed, subtly, convincingly. Guards were still present, but they moved as if routine had returned. A rumor was allowed to spread through the markets that the Sultan planned a short journey outside the city. A messenger was sent with the information, deliberately taking routes where spies were likely to watch. Meanwhile, the real preparations occurred in silence. Hidden archers placed in the trees along the chosen road, cavalry positioned behind ridges, foot soldiers concealed in dry riverbeds. Shamal oversaw the placements personally, his mind precise, his face expressionless. Turhan selected the men for the hidden units, men who would not panic, men who would not break formation when fire came. And in the palace, Malhatan and Nilüfer worked on their own battlefield. They did not carry swords openly, but their war was no less deadly. They questioned servants. They watched eyes. They listened to whispers. They tightened control over food and drink, over who entered which chamber, over which letters were delivered and which were burned. Esporcha, kept within the inner quarters, felt the pressure of those walls like a physical force. She was a warrior by nature. To be caged by protection was its own torture. Yet she understood the reason. She was a target not merely because she was close to Orhan, but because she was a wedge enemies could use to split the women of the palace, to make jealousy and pride do what swords could not. Late one night, when the palace was quiet and only the distant footsteps of guards echoed through the corridors, Nilüfer came to Esporcha's chamber. She dismissed the women outside and entered alone. The air between them was delicate as glass. They had spoken before, yes, but always with others nearby, always with the distance that court demanded. Tonight, there was no court, only two women standing in the shadow of a man's destiny. Esporcha rose, her posture guarded. Nilüfer looked at her for a long moment, then spoke softly. They are trying to turn us into enemies, she said. Esporcha's eyes flickered. I know, she replied. Nilüfer stepped closer. I have heard whispers, she said, poisoned whispers, that you will always be my shadow, that I fear you, that I should hate you. She took a breath. And perhaps once upon a time I might have been weak enough to let those whispers take root. Esporcha did not answer immediately. When she spoke, her voice was controlled, but beneath it something trembled. Daphne tried to make it true, she said. She tried to carve that hatred into us. Nilüfer nodded, and she failed, she said, because this is not about pride, it is about survival. Orhan cannot fight an empire if his home collapses. Esporcha's guarded posture softened slightly as if a knot inside her loosened. Then we must be stronger than their words, she said. Nilüfer reached out slowly as if offering a fragile piece. Then stand with me, she said, not behind me, not beneath me, with me. Esporcha looked at the hand. In her mind, she saw 1,000 things: her past, her loneliness, the way she had learned to trust no one, the way she had learned to hide her heart behind steel. Then she placed her hand in Nilüfer. With you, she said. And in that silent clasp, a fortress was built, one not of stone, but of understanding. Outside the palace, the trap was set. The day of the journey arrived under a sky that was bruised with clouds. The road Orhan would supposedly take ran through a stretch of forest, and then alongside a dry ravine, beautiful terrain and deadly. Orhan dressed not in full ceremonial armor but in the practical gear of travel, chainmail beneath a dark tunic, a cloak, his sword at his side, a small escort visible as if he were truly traveling lightly. But hidden nearby, Shamel's men waited. Archers lay prone under brush. Cavalry held behind hills, horses snorting softly, restrained by strong hands. Orhan positioned himself where he could see the road and the surrounding slopes, his eyes never blinking for long. Orhan rode out of Bursa's gate and felt the city fall behind him like a door closing. The escort moved with calculated casualness. They spoke softly as if discussing mundane matters. Orhan himself kept his face calm, his posture relaxed. Inside, he was a blade held inches from the enemy's throat. They entered the forest, the trees closed in, shadows deepened. The smell of damp earth rose around them, birds were quiet, too quiet. 100 paces in, Orhan saw the sign, a broken branch on the left, freshly snapped, then another, a mark, a signal the enemy was here. He continued forward as if unaware. The escort did the same. The trap required patience. And then the ambush sprang. It began with a whistle, sharp and foreign, followed by the sudden rush of men dropping from branches and rising from the undergrowth. They were not peasants. They moved like trained killers, blades short for close fighting, faces covered, eyes hard. Arrows flew from hidden positions, aimed not at the escort but at Orhan's horse, trying to bring him down, trying to force him into the mud where numbers could overwhelm him. Orhan leaned low, guiding Karanlık with his knees, making the horse dance sideways, avoiding the first volley. One arrow grazed the stallion's neck, drawing a thin line of blood. Karanlık snorted in pain but did not panic. He had been trained for war. Orhan's hand tightened on the reins. The attackers surged in. Orhan drew his sword and met them with controlled violence, each strike efficient, each movement economical. He did not fight like a man seeking glory, he fought like a man who understood that survival was victory. His escort formed a tight circle around him, shields outward, blades stabbing through gaps. The attackers pressed harder. They shouted orders in a language that was not Turkish, Greek perhaps, or a rough dialect of the coast. Orhan heard it and felt the cold confirmation: imperial agents, Faladios's knives. Then Orhan gave the signal, a short upward flick of his blade. At once the forest itself answered. Shamel's archers rose from concealment and loosed a devastating volley into the attackers' flanks. Men dropped like cut wheat. Before the ambushers could react, Orhan's cavalry burst from behind the ridge, thundering through the trees with a roar that shook leaves from branches. Horses slammed into bodies. Steel flashed. The ambushers, caught in a trap of their own making, stumbled into panic. But their leader was no fool. He had anticipated a trap. He blew another whistle, longer this time, and from deeper in the forest came a second wave, heavier, more armored, carrying hooked spears and nets. Nets meant not to kill but to capture, meant to take Orhan alive. Orhan's blood ran cold. Alive meant leverage. Alive meant the palace forced to negotiate. Alive meant shame. Alive meant the realm's spine broken. He shouted a single command and his men tightened formation. The second wave hit like a tidal surge, nets flying, hooks snagging shields, spears thrusting low for legs and horses. One net caught an escort rider and yanked him off his saddle. Another net flew toward Orhan. Orhan slashed it midair, but the distraction was enough. A hooked spear caught Karanlık's foreleg and yanked. The great stallion stumbled, almost falling. Orhan threw his weight to keep him upright. Two attackers lunged for Orhan's legs, trying to pull him down. Orhan's sword flashed. One attacker's hand fell to the ground, severed at the wrist. The other took a boot to the face and staggered back. But the pressure was immense. Even with Shamil and Orhan's forces now fully engaged, the enemy had come prepared, and the forest became a spinning nightmare of smoke from fired arrows, mud churned by hooves, blood splattering across leaves, steel ringing like a mad bell. And then through the chaos, Orhan saw him. Not in armor, not masked. A man standing at the edge of the fight beneath a tree, watching with calm interest as if observing a performance staged for his pleasure. His cloak was dark, his hair tied back, his posture elegant. Even from a distance, Orhan recognized the aura of a court creature, someone comfortable among kings, someone who believed himself above the mud and blood of common soldiers. Faladios. The name was no longer a whisper, it was a living shadow at the edge of his battlefield. Orhan's rage rose like fire, but he did not let it consume his mind. He understood instantly, Faladios had come not to fight but to verify, to see whether the Sultan could be taken, to measure the strength of Bursa's defenses, to decide the next move. Orhan made his own decision in a heartbeat. He would not merely repel this ambush, he would try to take Faladios. He spurred Karanlik forward, cutting through the melee with two of his best riders at his side. Shamil saw the movement and tried to follow, but the battle was thick. Turhan, from the opposite flank, shouted something lost in the roar. Orhan drove hard toward Faladios. The elegant man finally reacted, stepping back, signaling to two bodyguards who moved in front of him with long blades and round shields. They were skilled, their stance disciplined. Orhan did not slow, he crashed into them like a storm. His first strike split a shield rim and bit into the guard's shoulder. The second guard lunged at Karanlik's chest. Orhan parried, then drove his blade into the man's thigh, forcing him down. Orhan's two riders finished the guards with quick, brutal cuts. Faladios turned and ran into the trees. Orhan pursued, his horse weaving between trunks, branches whipping his face. Faladios moved fast for a court man, too fast, not just a diplomat trained. He slipped through a narrow gap between rocks where a horse could not pass. Orhan dismounted instantly, tossing the reins to a rider. He ran on foot, sword in hand, boots slipping on wet leaves. The chase became intimate, primal, two men in a forest, one hunted by the other, destiny narrowing to breath and footfalls. Faladios glanced back once, his face pale but composed, and Orhan saw something there, not fear but calculation. Even now, Faladios was thinking ahead. They broke into a small clearing choked with mist. Faladios stopped and turned, drawing a thin blade, not a soldier's weapon but a duelist, quick and precise. Orhan stepped forward, his sword heavier, meant for war, not duels. But he had dueled before. He had fought men who thought finesse could defeat force. Steel met steel. Faladios moved like a serpent, striking fast at Orhan's wrists, his throat, his gaps. Orhan blocked and advanced, using pressure, pushing Faladios backward step by step. The duel was not loud, it was the sound of blades whispering, the sound of breath, the sound of boots on wet grass. Faladios spoke as he fought, his voice smooth, almost amused, as if he enjoyed talking while death hovered between them. "You are impressive, Sultan," he said. "Andreas was right to fear you." Orhan's eyes stayed locked on him. "Speak his name again," he growled, "and I will carve your tongue out." Faladios smiled faintly. "You cannot carve out what is already everywhere," he replied. "Andreas is only one thread, the emperor is the loom." Orhan feinted high, then struck low, aiming to cut Faladios's leg. Faladios leapt back, but his heel caught on a root, and for a split second his balance broke. Orhan surged, bringing his sword down in a killing arc. Faladios twisted aside. The blade missed his skull by inches and struck his shoulder instead, slicing through cloak and flesh. Blood bloomed dark. Faladios hissed, stumbling. Orhan raised his sword again. "This is where it ends," he said. Faladios, breathing hard now, eyes flashing with something like anger, reached into his cloak with his free hand. Orhan's instincts screamed again, poison needle, hidden weapon, something small and deadly. Orhan lunged to stop him, and the world exploded with pain. Not from Faladios but from behind. A third man crashed into Orhan's back, slamming him to the ground. Orhan rolled, slashing upward, catching the attacker's arm. The man screamed and fell away, but another was already there, and another. Faladios had not come alone. He had led Orhan here, away from his men, into a pocket of killers. Orhan sprang to his feet, back to a tree, sword raised, breathing controlled despite the pain in his ribs. 3 attackers circled him, their blades short, their eyes hungry. Faladios stood a few paces back, clutching his bleeding shoulder, watching with cold satisfaction. "You see, Sultan," Faladios said softly, "even lions can be herded." Orhan's mind raced. He could fight 3 men, perhaps, but if more came, he would be buried. He needed space, needed his men, needed to break the circle. He shifted his stance, inviting an attack. One man lunged. Orhan sidestepped and drove his blade into the attacker's side, ripping it free in a spray of blood. The second attacked immediately, slashing at Orhan's face. Orhan ducked and punched the man's throat with his gauntlet-crushing windpipe, then finished him with a thrust. The third hesitated, suddenly seeing death as something real. Faladios's eyes narrowed. He signaled, and from the trees, more footsteps. Orhan's chest tightened. Too many. And then, like thunder answering prayer, came the sound of Turhan's voice roaring through the forest, followed by the crash of bodies and the ring of steel. Shamel's men had followed the trail. They poured into the clearing, cutting down Faladios's killers with brutal force. One of Orhan's riders leapt between him and Faladios, taking a blade meant for Orhan's back. Faladios saw the tide turn. He did not waste time. He turned and fled, vanishing into the misty trees like a shadow slipping under a door. Orhan tried to pursue, but pain flared in his ribs and he stopped, breathing hard, watching the trees swallow Faladios whole. Shamil reached him, face fierce, eyes scanning Orhan for wounds. Sultan Shamil said, "Are you hurt?" Orhan's gaze stayed fixed on the forest. "Faladios is wounded," he said, "but he escaped." Turhan arrived moments later, blood on his blade, fury in his eyes. "He should not have escaped," he growled. Orhan's voice was low, dangerous. "He will not escape forever," he said. "Tonight we learned something. Faladios is close, close enough to breathe the same air. And if he is here, it means the Emperor's hand is reaching again toward Bursa." He turned to his commanders. "We end this in the only way it can end," he said. "Not by waiting behind walls, not by reacting to their knives. We go to Samandaria, we go to the heart of their nest. We take Andreas. We break Shahanshah. And we drag Faladios into daylight where shadows cannot save him." Shamil hesitated. "Sultan," he said, "Bursa's defenses." "Malhatan will hold Bursa," Orhan replied without hesitation. "Nilufar will hold the palace. Esporcha will stand with them, and we will take the war to the place where it is born." Turhan's eyes burned with approval. "Finally," he said. Orhan looked down at the wounded rider who had taken the blow meant for him, now dying in the mud, eyes glassy. Orhan knelt, gripping the man's hand. The rider tried to speak but could not. Orhan leaned close. "Your name will be remembered," he whispered. "Your family will be honored, I swear it." The rider's fingers tightened once, then went still. Orhan rose slowly, grief and rage braided together inside him like rope. This was the cost, this was always the cost. They returned to Bursa before nightfall, not in celebration but in grim readiness. The palace received Orhan like a fortress receiving its commander, quiet, tense, controlled. Nilufar saw the dried blood on his sleeve and her face tightened, but she did not cry. Esporcha saw the bruise forming on his jaw and her eyes flashed, but she did not lash out. Malhatan heard the report and simply nodded once as if she had expected nothing less. In the council chamber that night, under lantern light that cast long shadows on the walls, Orhan laid out the next campaign like a man laying out a burial shroud. Samandaria would be the target. Not a full siege too costly, too slow, but a swift strike. A decapitation. A night raid if possible. They would infiltrate, capture Andreas, and force him to reveal the Emperor's deeper plan. They would also locate Shahanshah, the man whose ambition had made him vulnerable to manipulation. And if Faladios appeared, they would not let him slip away again. Shamil outlined the logistics: boats needed, covert crossings, supply caches. Turhan outlined the assault units: small, lethal groups trained for close fighting in tight corridors, men who could move in silence, men who could kill without hesitation. Ebrenos offered intelligence, routes, guard rotations, weak points in the fortress's outer defenses. Orhan listened, then added his own layer, the psychological layer. "We will not only strike," he said, "we will make them afraid. We will make them understand that no wall is high enough, no basilica holy enough, no emperor distant enough. When we leave Samandaria, the story they tell in Constantinople will not be of their power. It will be of their vulnerability." When the council ended, Orhan walked alone through the palace corridors, his thoughts heavy. He stopped outside the women's quarters. He knew what waited inside: worry, questions, love sharpened by fear. He entered. Nilufar was there, Malhatan beside her. Esporcha stood near the window, arms crossed, gaze hard as stone. When Orhan appeared, all three women looked at him as if reading the future on his face. He spoke without prelude. Faladios was here, he said. He tried to take me alive. Nilufer's breath caught, Esporcha's jaw tightened, Malhattan's eyes narrowed. Orhan continued, he escaped, wounded, but now we know, they are not satisfied with battles in the mountains. They want Bursa. They want my house divided. They will use poison, whispers, and knives. Malhattan stepped forward. Then we become harder than poison, she said. We become quieter than whispers. We become sharper than knives. Orhan looked at her, then at Nilufer, then at Esporcha. I am leaving again, he said, to Samandaria. Nilufer's eyes flashed with pain. Again she whispered. Orhan stepped close, taking her hands. I do not leave because I want to, he said. I leave because if I do not, they will come here again and again until they succeed. I would rather fight them in their nest than let them hunt you in your home. Esporcha spoke, her voice low but steady. Then take me, she said. Orhan looked at her sharply. No. She did not flinch. I am a warrior, she said. I am not porcelain to be locked away. Faladios is hunting you. Let me hunt him too. Nilufer glanced at Esporcha, then back to Orhan. For a moment the old court tension flickered, but it did not ignite. Instead, Nilufer spoke with unexpected firmness. If you leave, she said, you leave knowing that your house stands. We will hold Bursa together. Orhan felt something tighten in his throat. He had expected fear, argument, tears. Instead, he was given a fortress built out of 3 women's resolve. It humbled him more than any battle. Malhattan placed a hand on his arm. Go, she said. Do what must be done. And know this, if they send knives here, they will find that women of this house know how to bleed without falling. Orhan nodded once, unable for a moment to speak. That night, as Bursa slept under a sky full of restless clouds, Orhan prepared to leave again. Horses were readied, weapons checked, men chosen. Shamal and Tarhan would accompany him. Ebrenos would remain to support Bursa's defense and coordinate intelligence. Messengers were dispatched to allied tribes. Supply caches along the route were prepared. Before dawn, Orhan stood at the palace gate. Nilufer came to him, wrapped in a cloak, her face pale in the torchlight. Esporcha stood a few steps behind, her posture straight, eyes fixed on Orhan as if engraving his face into memory. Nilufer reached up and adjusted the clasp on his cloak, a small, intimate gesture that carried 1,000 unspoken words. Then she pressed her forehead to his for a brief moment. Return, she whispered. Orhan's voice was rough. I will, he said. Esporcha stepped forward then, her gaze fierce. Do not chase shadows into traps again, she said. Next time let the shadows come to you. Orhan's mouth tightened into a faint, grim smile. Next time, he said, the shadows will find I have learned to bite in the dark. He mounted Karenlik. Shamal and Tarhan mounted beside him. The gates opened. The small force rode out into the pre-dawn gray, leaving behind the city that depended on them, riding toward the fortress where the enemy believed himself safe. And far away, across the sea, in Samandaria's cold stone halls, Faladios pressed a cloth to his wounded shoulder and listened as Andreas raged about the failure to capture Orhan. Faladios's eyes remained calm, calculating, almost amused, as if failure was simply another piece on the board. He spoke softly, and his words were like a knife sliding into a rib. The Sultan is not only a warrior, he said, he is becoming a strategist. That makes him more dangerous than any army. Andreas snarled, then we kill him, he spat. We kill him and Bursa collapses. Faladios smiled faintly, pain flickering across his face as the wound throbbed. Yes, he murmured, we will kill him, but not with a blade in the forest, not with arrows on a road. He looked toward the window where the sea lay gray under the sky. We will kill him with what he cannot cut, he whispered. We will kill him with a choice. Outside, the waves struck the rocks like drums. And as Orhan's riders moved across the land toward Samandaria, as the smoke of their campfires rose thin into the morning, as steel was checked and prayers whispered, fate began to tighten its grip. Because the next chapter would not be decided only by strength. It would be decided by loyalty tested to its breaking point, by betrayal hidden behind smiles, by a trap built not of fire and arrows but of human hearts. And somewhere ahead, in a fortress of stone and lies, Faladios was preparing to offer Orhan Saheb a decision that could shatter everything he had fought to build, if the Sultan's will was even slightly less than iron. Dawn that carried Arhan Sahib away from Bursa was not a gentle dawn, not the kind that rose with birdsong and the softness of ordinary life, but a cold gray awakening, as if the sky itself had opened its eyes after a sleepless night and looked down upon the earth with warning. Mist lay low over the fields outside the city walls, coiling around the hooves of the horses, swallowing the lower bodies of the riders until they seemed less like men of flesh and more like spirits summoned from some ancient oath. Behind them, Bursa stood silent under the first pale light, its towers dark against the sky, its gates closing slowly with a deep wooden groan that sounded too much like the closing of a tomb. Nilofer had watched him ride out until the mist consumed him. Esporcha had stood beside her, her hand closed tightly around the hilt of the dagger hidden beneath her cloak, her eyes burning with the anger of being left behind and the deeper fear of understanding why she had to be. Mal Hatun had not watched from the gate. She had turned back before the horses disappeared because she knew the work of holding a realm did not allow a woman to stand too long with grief in her hands. Arhan rode at the front, Karenlik's breath steaming in the cold, his black mane damp with mist. To his right rode Turhan, broad-shouldered and grim, a man whose silence before battle was more frightening than another man's shouting. To his left rode Shamal, eyes narrowed, mind already measuring distances, routes, ambush points, river crossings, and the patience of enemies. Behind them moved the chosen force, not a grand army with drums and banners, but a lean blade of men selected for speed, loyalty, and silence. These were not soldiers gathered to impress the eyes of allies. These were men chosen to enter a nest of serpents and come out carrying fangs in their fists. They did not take the main roads. Arhan had learned the price of roads. Roads were watched, bought, poisoned, remembered. Roads carried merchants, pilgrims, shepherds, tax collectors, spies, and fools who spoke too freely after wine. Instead, they moved along broken ridgelines and old shepherd tracks, through wet ravines where water whispered over stone, through forests where the branches scratched their cloaks like fingers trying to hold them back. The land between Bursa and Samandaria was no empty stretch of earth. It was a living map of loyalties and betrayals, of villages that prayed for Ottoman protection, of old Byzantine farms where men smiled too carefully, of ruined watchtowers that had once belonged to forgotten lords and now belonged only to owls, foxes, and whatever secret messengers dared pass through them at night. As the sun climbed, the mist burned away, revealing hills washed in weak light. Arhan spoke little. His eyes did most of his speaking. He watched the way smoke rose from distant villages, the way crows lifted suddenly from groves, the way shepherd boys stared too long at armed riders before pretending not to stare. War taught a ruler that everything was a message if one had the patience to read it. A shutter closed too quickly could mean fear. A dog that did not bark could mean strangers had already fed it. A road without travelers could mean an ambush had frightened them away. And in Arhan's mind, one name moved like a dark thread through every thought: Faladios. Faladios had escaped wounded, but men like him did not need both arms strong to be dangerous. They were dangerous because their true weapon was not their blade. It was the space between men, the weakness between a promise and suspicion, the narrow crack between pride and humiliation. Andreas was a snake with venom. Shahansha was ambition wearing a crown of doubt, but Faladios was different. Faladios was the hand that arranged the snakes in the basket and waited to see who would bite first. By midday, the riders reached a narrow river crossing hidden between willow trees. The water ran cold over pale stones, and the horses lowered their heads to drink while the men checked straps, loosened saddles, and ate in silence. Turhan stood beside Arhan near the bank, his gaze fixed on the opposite shore. At last he said in a low voice that he disliked this war because it had too many doors and not enough walls. On a battlefield, he said, a man could see the enemy's banners, hear the drums, smell the horses, but here the enemy wore the face of a servant, a traitor, a priest, even a frightened child. Arhan answered without looking away from the water that this was why they must stop fighting only the men who carried swords and begin fighting the minds that placed those swords in hidden hands. Turhan grunted, not because he disagreed, but because he preferred problems that could be split open with steel. Shamal approached with 2 scouts. Their cloaks were mud-stained, their faces drawn from hard riding. One of them had been ahead toward the coastal track that curved north of Samandaria, and he reported that patrols had doubled near the fortress, but not in the ordinary manner. They were not expecting an army. They were watching for messengers, for small groups, for disguised travelers. The second scout had crossed near the salt marshes and seen signal fires being lit at strange intervals along the coast. Not alarms, not military beacon language, but something irregular, perhaps a private code. Arhan listened and felt the net in the distance. Faladios knew he might come. Andreas knew rage would eventually push the Ottomans towards Samandaria. The fortress was not sleeping, it was pretending to sleep. Then Orhan asked about the harbor, and the scout said that the burned Karasi ships had sent waves of fear through the coastal garrisons, yet small vessels still moved at night without lanterns, slipping between coves and monastery docks, carrying men who did not answer to local commanders. At that, Shamel's face darkened. He said that if Faladios moved by sea, then the water itself had become a road for betrayal. Orhan looked at the river, at the current slipping around stones, and said softly that every road could be blocked if one knew where it narrowed. They rode again before the horses had fully rested. Speed mattered now, but concealment mattered more. As the day leaned toward evening, they climbed into a wooded highland overlooking the distant coast. There, between two ridges, Orhan ordered a temporary halt. No fires were to be lit, no metal exposed to moonlight, no prayers spoken loudly. The men settled into the trees, wrapping themselves in cloaks, eating dry bread, dried meat, olives, in silence. Above them, the sky darkened, and one by one the stars appeared. Somewhere far below, the sea breathed against the shore, a slow, monstrous breathing, endless and indifferent. That night, Orhan could not sleep. He walked beyond the camp to a rocky outcrop where he could see the faint glimmer of Samandaria in the distance. The fortress lay like a dark tooth against the coast, its walls catching moonlight, its towers sharp, its inner church dome pale and cold. It seemed small from so far away, almost harmless, but Orhan knew better. Places like that did not need size to be dangerous. They gathered secrets the way deep wells gathered water. Shamel found him there after a time. The commander did not ask whether he was troubled because the answer was too obvious. Instead, he said that the men were ready, that if Orhan gave the order, they could move before dawn, cut through the olive terraces, reach the outer wall by the second night, and attempt infiltration through the drainage tunnel Abrenos had marked years before. Orhan kept his eyes on the fortress and asked if Shamel trusted the information. Shamel answered that he trusted Abrenos, but not time. A tunnel known years ago might be sealed now, guarded now, trapped now. Orhan nodded. That was exactly his fear. Then Tarhan arrived, carrying a strip of cloth taken from a tree branch near the lower path. It was dyed with a dark blue thread pattern, almost invisible in moonlight. He said the scouts had found 3 more tied in the woods below, markers placed by someone guiding men through the terrain, not Ottoman, not local shepherd signs. Orhan took the cloth between his fingers and felt the weave. Fine, expensive, courtly. Faladios again, or someone moving for him. Orhan's jaw tightened. The enemy was not merely waiting in Samandaria. The enemy was already in the hills around them. So he changed the plan. Instead of pushing directly toward the fortress, Orhan split his force before dawn. Shamel would take the larger body of men and continue along the expected hidden route, letting the enemy see enough movement to believe the Ottomans had committed to an infiltration from the north. Tarhan would take a smaller, harder unit and sweep the lower woods, silently removing any watchers and turning their markers against them. Orhan himself would travel with only 12 men along the old pilgrim path that descended toward a ruined monastery 2 leagues west of Samandaria. If Faladios had built a net around the obvious approaches, then Orhan would slip through a forgotten tear in the cloth. Tarhan objected at once, as he always did when Orhan placed himself close to the knife. He said a sultan was not a shadow to crawl through ruins with 12 men. Orhan looked at him and replied that tonight a sultan who moved like an army would be expected, but a sultan who moved like a rumor might reach the truth. Tarhan's mouth tightened, but he bowed his head. He did not like it. He would obey it. Before they separated, Orhan clasped Tarhan's arm, then Shamel's. There were no grand words. Grand words belonged to men who needed courage from sound. These men carried courage in bone. Orhan simply told them that if the fortress bells rang before midnight, Shamel was to begin the false assault at the northern slope and draw every guard toward the noise. If no bells rang, they would wait until the 3rd watch. If fire rose from the monastery, Tarhan was to close the western road and allow no one to escape toward the coast. Each order was clean, precise, and shaped by the knowledge that plans in darkness often lived or died by simple signals. Then the force broke apart. Orhan and his 12 descended through pine woods where the ground was soft with needles and the air smelled of resin. The old pilgrim path was nearly gone, a ribbon of stone half buried beneath moss. Once long ago, monks and pilgrims had walked this way with candles and prayers. Now warriors moved over it with knives and muffled swords, and the prayers were whispered inside their chests. The ruined monastery appeared near dusk, crouched among cypress trees on a rise overlooking the sea. Its outer walls were broken, its bell tower cracked, its chapel roof partly collapsed. Vines had swallowed half the stonework, and sea wind moaned through empty window arches like the voices of the dead. Orhan halted at the edge of the trees. Something was wrong. Ruins should have a smell: damp stone, old dust, wild grass, birds. This place smelled faintly of wax, fresh wax. He signaled his men to spread. 2 moved toward the left wall, 2 toward the collapsed chapel, 3 remained behind with the horses, the rest followed him in. They entered through a broken archway, boots silent on dust. The moon had not risen yet, and twilight turned the monastery interior blue and gray. A raven burst from a beam overhead, making one of the men flinch, but Orhan raised a hand to steady them. Then he saw it, beneath the cracked altar where darkness pooled, a sliver of yellow light. A hidden chamber. Orhan moved closer, crouched, and found the edge of a concealed hatch half covered by fallen stone. Voices drifted up faintly from below. One voice was rough, nervous, speaking of patrol rotations. Another was smoother, almost bored, saying that the Sultan would come because proud men always followed insult. Orhan's hand tightened around his sword. Faladios. He did not rush, he listened. There were at least 5 men below, perhaps more. They spoke of the fortress, of the western postern gate, of Andreas demanding assurance that the bait was ready. Then came the word that made Orhan's blood chill: hostage. A hostage had been moved to Samandaria that morning, someone important enough to be offered as a choice. Not Nilüfer, not Asporça, not Malhattan. Bursa was too guarded for that. But someone close enough to matter. Someone whose life could bend Orhan's actions. Then Faladios's voice rose again from below, cold and delicate, saying that if Orhan Saheb wished to save the wounded wolf, he would have to put his hand into the trap. The wounded wolf. Darsan. For a heartbeat, Orhan forgot to breathe. Darsan had been taken home wounded, guarded, helpless. His mother had watched over him. If Faladios had reached Darsan, then the enemy's web was wider than Orhan had imagined. Rage flooded him so quickly that one of his men beside him saw the change in his face and instinctively stepped back. But rage alone would kill Darsan. Rage alone would spring the trap exactly as Faladios intended. Orhan forced himself still. He listened more. Faladios was telling his men that Darsan had been moved secretly by coastal agents, that the old woman had been left alive because grief would carry the message faster than any courier. Andreas wanted Darsan displayed in the fortress courtyard at dawn, to lure Orhan into a reckless assault. Faladios disagreed. He wanted the choice delivered privately: surrender the Ottoman spy network along the coast, expose the dervish routes and Darsan lives. Refuse, and Darsan dies before Orhan's eyes. That was the weapon Faladios had promised Andreas, not a blade but a choice. Loyalty against strategy. One man's life against the hidden arteries of a state. Orhan closed his eyes briefly. In war, a commander learned to sacrifice. He learned to weigh lives, but Darsan was not a number on a map. Darsan had bled for him. Darsan had ridden beside men Orhan loved. Darsan had a mother whose prayers still clung to the walls of a small house under a fig tree, and Faladios knew that. Faladios did not attack the body first. He attacked the place where duty and love became one wound. Orhan opened his eyes. He signaled silently. 2 men moved to block the outer exits. One man prepared a torch but did not light it. Another lifted a small jar of smoke powder used by raiders to blind men in tunnels. Orhan waited until one of the voices below moved closer to the hatch, perhaps to climb out. Then he kicked the hatch open. The man below looked up just in time to see judgment descending. Orhan dropped into the chamber like a falling shadow, landing hard, sword already moving. The first guard died before he could shout. The second drew a dagger and lunged. Orhan slammed him against the wall and drove steel through his ribs. Smoke powder burst across the chamber as Orhan's men came down after him, turning lamplight into a choking yellow haze. Men coughed, cursed, stumbled, swung blind. Ottoman blades worked in silence. Faladios' wounded shoulder bound beneath his cloak, moved faster than expected. He overturned a table, scattered parchment into the air, and slipped toward a narrow passage at the rear of the chamber. Orhan saw him and shouted his name, not loudly, but with enough force that every man in that underground room felt the hatred in it. Faladios turned once, his face half-lit by lampfire and smoke. He smiled as if pleased that the Sultan had arrived exactly where he wanted him. Then he vanished into the passage. Orhan pursued, but not blindly this time. He had learned. He sent 2 men ahead low, shields raised, and followed 3 paces behind. The passage was narrow, carved through old stone, descending slightly, smelling of damp earth and salt air. Somewhere ahead, Faladios's footsteps echoed, then stopped. Orhan halted at once. Silence, too perfect. He crouched and touched the ground. A thin wire crossed the passage at ankle height, almost invisible. Attached to it, hidden in the wall, were small clay pots. Oil, fire trap. Had Orhan charged like an angry bull, flame would have swallowed him and his men in the tunnel. He almost smiled. Faladios was clever, but clever men often began to believe no one else could learn. Orhan ordered one of his men to wedge the wire in place with a knife while another carefully removed the clay pots. Then they advanced. The passage forked. One way led toward the sea, the other toward the fortress, likely the same forgotten route Abrenos had once described, passing beneath old ecclesiastical foundations and emerging near Samandaria's western postern. Faladios had used the monastery as a breathing hole for his network. Orhan chose the fortress path. Faladios wanted him lured there, so be it. But now Orhan would arrive not as prey walking into a trap, but as a hunter already inside the burrow. Behind him, his men searched the chamber and recovered maps, coded letters, names of coastal contacts, and one parchment sealed but not yet sent. It bore the mark of Andreas. Orhan broke the seal and read enough to know the truth. Darsan was held in the lower prison of Samandaria, alive but weak. At dawn, if Orhan did not respond to the ultimatum, Darsan would be hanged from the inner wall, his body left visible to the northern road. The words settled into Orhan like ice. He folded the parchment carefully and placed it inside his cloak. Then he gave the order. They would move now. No waiting for the third watch. No false assault yet. If they could reach the lower prison before dawn, they might pull Darsan from the jaws of the trap before the enemy realized the trap had been entered from beneath. The underground passage was long and suffocating. Water dripped from the ceiling. Rats fled before them. Roots had broken through old stone in places, twisting like dead fingers. At intervals they found hidden niches with supplies, oil lamps, ropes, spare cloaks, sealed messages, foreign coins. Faladios had built a whole secret road under the skin of the land. Orhan's fury deepened, but so did his respect for the scale of the threat. This was not improvisation. This was architecture. After nearly an hour, they reached a stone grate through which cold air flowed. Beyond it came the faint sound of waves, and higher above, the muffled tread of guards. Samandaria. Orhan looked through the grate and saw a narrow service corridor beyond, torchlit, empty for the moment. One of his men produced a hooked tool and began to loosen the old iron bolts. Each scrape sounded deafening in the confined dark. The men held their breath. Finally, the grate shifted. They slipped through one by one. They were inside the fortress. Samandaria at night was a living creature of stone. Its corridors curved unpredictably, its walls sweating with sea damp, its torches smoky, its shadows thick. From somewhere above came the distant chanting of priests in the basilica, a low solemn murmur that made the violence moving beneath it feel even darker. Orhan and his men moved through the service passages with blades drawn, following the rough map from the stolen parchment. Twice they flattened themselves against walls as patrols passed nearby. Once they had to silence a guard who turned a corner too quickly. Orhan caught him by the mouth, drove a dagger under his ribs, and lowered him gently to the floor without a sound. They descended toward the lower prison, where the air grew colder and fouler. The smell of old straw, rust, sweat, and despair thickened around them. At the end of a stairway, two guards stood before a barred door. One yawned, the other leaned on his spear. They died quickly, one with Shamel's knife, because Shamel had reached the western breach with a small advance unit and joined them in the lower corridor like a ghost fulfilling a prophecy, and one beneath Orhan's hand. When Shamel appeared from the shadows, Orhan gave him the briefest look of approval. No embrace, no surprise. In war, relief had no time to flower. Shamel whispered that Tarhan had sealed the western road and intercepted two riders trying to leave for the coast. One carried a message for Andreas. Another carried coded orders bearing Faladios's mark. The net was beginning to tear. They opened the prison door. Inside, cells lined the walls. Men lay in darkness, some prisoners of war, some criminals, some poor souls taken because they had been useful to someone cruel. Orhan moved past them, eyes searching. At the final cell, he found Darsan. Darsan was chained upright against the wall, his wounded body barely able to hold itself, his face pale, lips cracked, hair matted with sweat. Yet his eyes opened when Orhan approached, and in those eyes, even through fever, something like shame appeared. He tried to speak, tried to apologize for being taken, but Orhan reached through the bars and gripped his shoulder, telling him in a low voice that wolves did not apologize for bleeding. They endured. And tonight, he would endure a little longer. The lock was heavy. Shamel worked it with tools while Orhan watched the corridor. Every second seemed to stretch. A distant bell rang above once. Then again, not alarm, a watch change. Time was moving toward dawn. The lock opened. Darsan sagged as the chains were cut, and Orhan caught him before he hit the ground. Darsan was lighter than he should have been, fever-hot, shaking. One of the men wrapped him in a cloak. Another gave him water drop by drop. Darsan whispered that his mother, Orhan leaned close and told him she lived, that she had prayed him back once and would do so again. Darsan closed his eyes, and a tear cut a clean line through the grime on his cheek. They began to withdraw. That was when the bells began. Not one, not two. Every bell in Samandaria erupted at once, a violent storm of bronze that shook dust from the ceiling and turned the fortress from sleeping beast to awakened monster. Somewhere a body had been found. Somewhere Faladios had reached a signal point. Somewhere Andreas had realized the Sultan was inside. Shamal cursed under his breath. Orhan tightened his grip on Darsan. The quiet rescue was over, now came steel. They moved fast through the lower corridor, but guards were already pouring down the stairs, half-armored, shouting in confusion. Orhan handed Darsan to two men and stepped forward. The first wave hit them at the turn of the stair. There was no room for elegance. This was close fighting at its ugliest, shields jammed against bodies, blades thrust into bellies, elbows, knees, teeth, men slipping in blood on stone steps. Orhan fought at the front because the corridor was too narrow for more than two men at a time, and his sword became a door no enemy could pass. Shamal fought beside him, shorter blade flickering into gaps, cutting wrists, throats, the inside of thighs. They gained the service corridor, but alarms spread above like fire through dry grass. Horns sounded, boots thundered, voices shouted orders in Greek and Latin. The fortress gates were being sealed. The western postern might already be blocked. Tarhan's men outside would hear the bells and begin their part, but inside the walls, Orhan's small force had to survive long enough to reach an exit. Then a voice rang down the corridor, smooth, amplified by stone. Faladios. He called Orhan Saheb by name, not shouting like a soldier but speaking as if from a balcony in a theater. He said that the Sultan had done beautifully, that love had brought him inside faster than any threat could have done, that Darsan lived only because Faladios had wished to prove a point. Orhan turned slowly. At the far end of the corridor, beyond a line of armed guards, Faladios stood with Andreas beside him. Andreas's face was twisted with rage, but Faladios looked calm despite his bandaged shoulder and pale skin. He held a folded parchment in one hand. And there, dragged between two soldiers, was another prisoner. Not a commander, not a warrior. A young dervish courier, one of the hidden messengers of the Ottoman coastal network, blood on his face, eyes swollen but alive. Orhan recognized him faintly from reports, one of the men who carried information between fishing villages, lodges, and loyal traders. Faladios placed a blade against the young man's throat and said that here was the true choice. Darsan could leave, perhaps, if Orhan abandoned the courier and the network he represented. Or Orhan could try to save everyone and lose everything. The corridor seemed to narrow around Orhan. Darsan was weak behind him. His men were few. Faladios had guards, Andreas, and the advantage of the fortress. Yet Orhan saw something in the arrangement. Faladios wanted him emotionally divided, wanted him to step forward, to bargain, to hesitate. The whole scene was staged as theater, and theater depended on the audience looking where the performer wanted. Orhan did not look at the blade, he looked at the torches. The corridor ceiling above Faladios was old wood and rope, supporting a hanging line of oil lamps used during night movements. One cut, one spark, and the center of the corridor would become smoke and flame. Dangerous, but danger could be a shield. Orhan lowered his sword slightly as if considering surrender. He asked Faladios what he wanted. Faladios smiled and began to speak of routes, names, codes, the men in Bursa who passed intelligence, the dervish lodges that hid riders, the fishermen who watched imperial ships. He wanted the arteries of Orhan's state opened before him. He wanted not one victory but the map of future victories. As he spoke, Orhan's left hand moved behind his back in the smallest signal. Shamal saw it. One of the Ottoman archers in the rear saw Shamal's responding flick. The archer lifted his bow slowly, using the bodies ahead as cover. Faladios continued speaking, confident now, thinking words had begun to bind the Sultan. He said that rulers always learned eventually that loyalty was a luxury, that states survived by selecting who would be sacrificed, that Orhan could either become practical or become a legend buried early. Orhan answered quietly that Faladios misunderstood him. He did not save men because he could not bear sacrifice. He saved them because loyalty repaid by abandonment rotted an army from within. A state built only on calculation became a market. A state built on loyalty became a fortress. And then he said, almost gently, that Faladios had spent too long among men who sold one another to understand the difference. Faladios' smile thinned. At that instant, the archer fired. The arrow flew not at Faladios, not at Andreas, but at the rope above them. It snapped. The line of oil lamps crashed down between the enemy guards, shattering across stone. Flame burst upward. Smoke exploded through the corridor. Men screamed. The dervish courier dropped as the soldiers holding him recoiled from fire. Orhan moved before thought could catch him. The corridor became chaos. Orhan surged through smoke, shield raised against arrows loosed blindly. Shamal and 2 men followed, cutting through confused guards. Andreas shouted for order, but his words drowned beneath coughing, bells, and flame. Faladios stumbled back, fury finally breaking through his composure. Orhan reached the courier first, seized him by the collar, and dragged him away from the fire. A guard lunged from the side. Orhan turned and cut him down. Another came with a spear. Shamal intercepted, blade flashing. Behind them, the men carrying Darsan fought to hold a corridor retreat open, their faces blackening with smoke. For one brief moment, Orhan and Faladios saw each other through the flames. Faladios' eyes held no amusement now, only calculation, anger, and a flicker of something deeper, fear, perhaps, or respect. Andreas tried to charge forward, but burning oil cut him off. Faladios grabbed his arm and pulled him back, shouting that this ground was lost. Andreas resisted, mad with rage, screaming that Orhan was right there, that he must be killed now. Faladios struck him across the face, not hard enough to injure but hard enough to command attention, and dragged him toward a side passage. That single act told Orhan everything. Faladios was not merely Andreas's tool. Faladios could command him when survival demanded it. Orhan tried to pursue, but a section of burning beam cracked overhead and collapsed between them, sending sparks and smoke roaring upward. The path vanished behind fire. No time. Orhan turned back and ordered withdrawal. They ran through the service passages with Darsan and the courier supported between them, pursued by guards who knew the fortress better but were hampered by smoke and confusion. Twice they took wrong turns and had to cut their way back. Once they found the tunnel entrance blocked by 3 soldiers and a chain gate that had been dropped after the alarm. Orhan's men, hearing the bells and seeing smoke rise from inside the fortress, had begun their external attack exactly as planned, striking the western road, killing messengers, firing arrows over the wall to create panic. Outside, war drums began to beat, not a full siege, but enough noise to make the garrison believe one was beginning. Inside, Orhan reached the chain gate. There was no time to pick the lock. He ordered men to wedge shields beneath it, and together they heaved. The chain groaned. Guards rounded the corridor behind them. Shamal held them off, fighting like a man possessed, taking a shallow cut across the cheek and not seeming to notice. Orhan threw his own strength into the gate. The iron lifted inch by inch. Darsan, fevered and barely conscious, tried to help and nearly collapsed. The courier, despite his injuries, grabbed the chain and pulled with them. The gate rose just enough. One by one, they slid beneath it. Shamal came last, rolling under as a spear thrust down and scraped across his back plate. Orhan slammed a broken spear shaft through the chain wheel, jamming the gate in place, trapping the pursuing guards on the other side. Then they plunged back into the underground passage. The retreat through the tunnel felt longer than the entry, because now every sound behind them might be pursuit, every shadow might be a blade, every breath Darsan took might be his last. The men carried him when he could not walk. The courier stumbled but refused help until he fell, then cursed himself, and Shamal hauled him up with one hand as if lifting a child. At last they reached the monastery chamber. The bodies of Faladios' men still lay in the smoke-stained underground room, but the outer ruins were no longer quiet. Torches moved beyond the broken arches. Voices shouted. Enemy riders had reached the monastery from a different path. Orhan's horn sounded outside, low and fierce. Orhan's force emerged into a ruin lit by fire and moonlight. Orhan had arrived with his unit, and the monastery courtyard had become a battlefield. Ottoman fighters moved among broken columns and fallen stones, using the ruin itself as cover. Enemy soldiers tried to push through the outer wall breach, but Orhan met them like an iron gate. He fought with brutal directness, his sword heavy, his shield cracked, his beard dark with sweat and blood. Each time an enemy tried to step into the courtyard, Orhan drove him back or cut him down. Orhan handed Darsan to waiting men and joined the fight. The enemy had numbers but not organization. They had come expecting to trap a fleeing sultan, not to meet Turhan in a ruin with Ottoman warriors already occupying the strongest positions. Shamal took archers to the collapsed chapel roof and rained arrows down into the breach. Orhan led a countercharge through the central courtyard, pushing the attackers back toward the cypress grove. Steel flashed beneath the moon. Men slipped on wet grass. Sparks flew where blades struck stone. The old monastery, once a place of prayer, now echoed with the music of war. Then from the coastal path, a new threat appeared, mounted soldiers bearing the imperial colors, riding hard with lances leveled. If they hit the Ottomans in the open courtyard, the rescue force might be crushed. Orhan saw it instantly. He shouted for the men to fall behind the broken wall and for archers to prepare. Turhan understood before the order finished. He and 6 men dragged a fallen beam across the narrow entry gap, turning it into an obstacle. The first horse struck it and went down violently, throwing its rider. The second tried to leap and impaled itself on sharpened, broken stakes hidden behind the beam. The charge collapsed into confusion at the breach, and Shamal's arrows finished what the trap began. Orhan seized the moment. He led a final surge, striking the disordered riders before they could reform. Turhan fought beside him, laughing once, a harsh battle sound, saying that at last the enemy had remembered how to die properly. Orhan did not laugh. His eyes were on the coast beyond the trees, where he saw a lantern flash 3 times from a small boat offshore. Faladios. He was escaping by sea. Orhan broke from the melee and ran toward the western slope overlooking the water. Below, in a narrow cove, a boat pushed away from shore. Figures moved aboard. One of them, cloaked, held his injured shoulder. Even from the height, Orhan knew him. Faladios looked back toward the burning monastery and for a moment distance seemed meaningless. Their eyes could not truly meet, but it felt as if they did. Shamal came up beside Orhan, bow in hand, breathing hard. He asked if he should try the shot. The distance was great, the light poor, the boat moving. Orhan looked at the small vessel sliding into darkness. For a heartbeat he wanted to say yes. He wanted the arrow loosed, wanted fate to decide, wanted Faladios' body dropped into black water. But then he stopped. Faladios wounded was more useful alive than dead if followed. Men like Faladios had roots, contacts, masters. Kill him in a boat and the web trembled but remained hidden. Let him run while watched and the web might reveal where it anchored. Orhan lowered Shamal's bow gently. No, he said, let the shadow flee, we will follow the direction of its fear. The monastery battle ended before dawn. The surviving enemy withdrew toward Samandaria, carrying panic with them. Orhan's force did not pursue to the wall. That would have been foolish. They had come for Darsan, the courier, and intelligence. They had taken all 3. They gathered the stolen maps, the coded letters, the imperial ring marks, the names of coastal agents. They burned what could not be carried. Then they vanished into the hills before the fortress garrison could organize a proper counterattack. At sunrise, from a ridge far away, Orhan looked back and saw Samandaria's walls glowing faintly in the first light, smoke rising from the direction of the monastery. The fortress still stood. Andreas still lived. Shahanshah still schemed. Faladios had escaped again. And yet something had changed. The enemy had tried to make Orhan choose between loyalty and strategy, and he had refused the terms of the game. He had taken Darsan, saved the courier, stolen the maps, exposed the hidden passage, and bloodied the enemy's pride inside its own shadowed corridors. Darsan was carried on a litter through the morning, drifting in and out of fever. At one point he opened his eyes and saw Orhan riding nearby. He whispered that he had failed, that because of him the Sultan had risked everything. Orhan looked down at him and said that a man who survives the enemy's chains has not failed. He has brought back proof of the enemy's fear. Darsan closed his eyes again, and this time the tension in his face eased. The courier, whose name was Yunus, rode with Shamal after his wounds were bound. He was young, perhaps too young for the kind of secrets he carried, but his eyes had hardened overnight. He told Orhan what he knew, that Faladios had been meeting agents not only from Andreas but also from men close to Shahanshah, that some among Shahanshah's circle feared Andreas's influence yet feared Orhan more, that a faction inside Samandaria believed the emperor would use them and abandon them once the Ottomans were weakened. Most important of all, Yunus revealed that Faladios had spoken of a gathering at the old coastal fortress of Calavrai within 7 nights, where envoys loyal to the emperor, Andreas's faction, and wavering lords from the border would meet to decide whether to launch a coordinated uprising behind Ottoman lines. Orhan listened with growing stillness. This was larger than assassination, larger than one fortress. Palladios was trying to ignite the border from within while imperial armies pressed from without. If successful, Bursa would be forced to defend every road, every bridge, every village. The Ottoman sword would be stretched thin until it snapped. Tarhan heard this and spat into the dirt, saying that traitors multiplied best in dark rooms. Orhan answered that then they would open the roof and let daylight in. They rode hard toward a hidden Ottoman lodge in the hills, a place used by dervishes, scouts, and messengers. It stood beside a spring under old plane trees, appearing from the outside to be only a humble traveler's shelter. But beneath its floor were storage rooms, maps, spare weapons, coded records, and men who could disappear into 3 provinces before sunset. There, Darsan was placed under the care of healers. Yunus gave testimony to scribes. Shamal coordinated riders to carry warnings back to Bursa and to allied tribes. Tarhan inspected the captured documents with the suspicion of a man who distrusted paper because it could not be punched in the face. Orhan sent one message to Bursa with his fastest rider. It told Malhatan that Darsan lived, that the enemy network had been exposed but not destroyed, that Palladios was fleeing by sea toward a larger gathering, and that Bursa must remain sealed in vigilance. He included a private line for Nilüfer, telling her that the house had held, that her strength had reached him even in the darkness beneath Samandaria. For Asporcha he sent no separate tenderness, only a short sentence that he knew she would understand. The shadows came and I bit. When the messages were gone, Orhan gathered Shamal, Tarhan, Yunus, and the lodge master around a low table lit by oil lamps. The captured maps were spread before them. Names were placed beside ports, roads, lodges, monasteries, noble houses. Threads of ink connected men to locations, locations to ships, ships to payments, payments to seals. Slowly, the enemy web became visible. Calavrai stood on a rocky headland 2 days by fast horse from their current position, less by boat if the wind favored. It was old, half-ruined, but defensible, with a small harbor hidden beneath cliffs. Perfect for secret meetings. Perfect for men who wished to speak treason while waves covered their voices. Orhan decided they would not wait 7 nights. They would arrive before the gathering, take positions unseen, watch who came, and strike only when the web was inside the jar. The goal was no longer only Palladios. The goal was every lord, envoy, and agent who believed Ottoman patience was weakness. Shamal advised caution. If they struck too early, the greater network might scatter. If too late, the uprising might already be in motion. Tarhan argued for surrounding the fortress and killing everyone who entered. Yunus, despite his youth, said quietly that some wavering lords might be turned if captured alive and shown that Palladios planned to sacrifice them to imperial ambition. Orhan looked at the young courier with approval. Pain had not made him stupid, it had made him sharper. So the strategy formed. They would divide again. Shamal would move with scouts and archers to the cliffs above Calavrai. Tarhan would take cavalry inland to block escape routes. Yunus would guide a small infiltration group through a fisher path to the lower harbor. Orhan would command the central strike, but this time he would not enter first. He had learned not to become the bait in every trap. Instead, he would become the hand that closed the trap. As night fell over the lodge, Orhan stepped outside beneath the plane trees. The spring murmured nearby. Men moved quietly in preparation, checking bows, counting arrows, wrapping hooves, sharpening knives. Above, the stars were bright. The world looked peaceful if one did not know how many men were plotting to stain it. Orhan thought of Bursa again. He saw Nilüfer reading his message by lamplight. He saw Asporcha's fierce half-smile at the line he had sent. He saw Malhatan ordering guards with the calm of a queen born from battle's smoke. He thought of Darsan's mother, who would soon learn her son had been stolen by enemies and stolen back by friends. He thought of the dead rider in the mud, the man whose family he had promised to honor. Every name became a stone in the foundation of his resolve. Then Tarhan joined him, carrying 2 cups of water from the spring. He handed one to Orhan and said that the men were ready, but men could not fight shadows forever. Orhan drank and said that shadows ended when fire was brought close enough. Tarhan looked toward the west, where Calavrai waited beyond darkness, and asked if Palladios would be there. Orhan answered that Palladios could not resist a room where powerful men were afraid. He would come, because men like him believed fear was a throne. Tarhan smiled grimly, then we will pull him from it. Before dawn they moved again. The road to Calavrai was harsher than the road to Samandaria. The land broke into cliffs and stony gullies with sparse trees twisted by sea wind. The weather turned against them by afternoon. Clouds rolled in from the water and rain began to fall in cold slanting sheets. The men welcomed it despite the misery because rain hid movement, muffled hooves, blurred distant sight. They rode wrapped in cloaks, faces shadowed, eyes fixed forward. Once they passed a burned farmstead where smoke still rose from blackened beams. No bodies remained, but a child's wooden toy lay in the mud near the doorway. Turhan dismounted, picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, then placed it on a stone under the remaining wall. No one spoke. No one needed to ask who had done it. Border chaos had already begun in small acts of cruelty. By the second evening, they reached the ridges above Calavrai. The old coastal fortress stood below, crouched on its headland, broken in places but alive with guarded secrecy. Lanterns glowed behind shuttered windows. Small boats rocked in the hidden harbor. Men moved in the courtyard with cloaks pulled tight against rain. Not many yet. The gathering had begun early. Orhan lay on the wet ground beneath a scrub pine, looking down with Shamil and Yunus beside him. One by one, figures arrived through the night. A local lord with 4 guards, a priestly envoy, 2 imperial officers, a merchant known to fund mercenaries. Then, near midnight, a dark boat entered the harbor without lanterns. Men disembarked. Among them, moving carefully because of his shoulder, was Faladios. Orhan felt the air change around him. The hunt had reached its next breath. But Faladios was not alone. Behind him came Andreas, hooded, angry even from a distance, and another figure whose arrival made Shamil inhale sharply, Shahansha. The ambitious claimant had come in person. This was no minor meeting. This was the heart of the conspiracy beating in one room. Orhan watched as they entered the central hall of the fortress. Rain struck the stones, waves hammered the cliffs below. The men of the conspiracy believed themselves protected by sea, darkness, and secrecy. They did not know that above them, Ottoman eyes watched every door. Orhan waited until the last arrivals entered, then he gave the signal. Shamil's archers moved first, silent along the cliffs, cutting down the outer sentries with arrows that vanished into rain. Yunus led men down the fisher path to secure the harbor, killing 2 boat guards and cutting mooring lines so vessels drifted helplessly against rocks. Turhan's cavalry sealed the inland road, forming a dark wall beyond the fortress gate. No one left. No one ran. Then Orhan descended. He did not storm the fortress with shouting. He entered like fate, quiet, inevitable. His men slipped through the lower breach and spread through the ruin, taking corridors, stairways, storage rooms. A guard turned and saw them too late. A hand covered his mouth, a knife found his heart. Another reached for a bell rope, an arrow pinned his hand to the wood. Within moments, the outer fortress belonged to Orhan. Only the central hall remained. Inside, the conspirators argued over maps and promises. Faladios stood near the table, speaking with that smooth, poisonous calm, telling Shahansha that if he wanted the throne, he must accept imperial aid fully, must allow coastal landings, must permit Andreas to coordinate border uprisings, must understand that hesitation was death. Shahansha's face was troubled. Ambition had brought him here, but fear now held him by the throat. Andreas mocked his weakness, saying a man who wanted a crown must not tremble at blood. Faladios turned that mockery into silk, telling Shahansha that history remembered only those brave enough to seize what destiny offered. Then the doors opened. Wind and rain swept into the hall, extinguishing one lamp. Every head turned. Orhan Saheb stood in the doorway, wet cloak hanging from his shoulders, sword in hand, eyes dark and calm. Behind him stood Shamil, Turhan, and armed men spreading along the walls. For a long second no one moved. Even the sea seemed to pause. Orhan stepped inside and said that destiny did not offer crowns to traitors. It offered ropes, exile, or graves. Chaos broke, guards drew blades, Ottoman warriors surged. The hall became a storm of steel. Tables overturned, maps scattered, lamps crashed, flame crawled across spilled oil. Turhan drove into the nearest cluster of guards like a bull into reeds, breaking shields, smashing men backward. Shamil moved toward the imperial officers, cutting them down before they could organize resistance. Yunus, young but transformed, tackled the merchant who tried to burn the documents, slamming his hand into the table and pinning him there with a dagger through the sleeve. Orhan's eyes were on Faladios. Andreas came first, snarling, sword raised, driven by humiliation and hatred. He attacked with strength and fury, raining blows meant to overwhelm. Orhan met him without haste. Steel clashed. Andreas cursed him, called him butcher, usurper, wolf, son of wolves. Orhan parried, stepped, turned, letting Andreas spend rage like a fool spending gold in a burning market. Then Orhan struck once to the wrist, once to the shoulder, once with the hilt into Andreas's mouth. Andreas staggered, blood spilling over his beard. Orhan kicked him to the ground and placed a boot on his chest. He could have killed him. Many men in that hall expected it. Andreas expected it too, and in his eyes there was a flash of almost eager defiance, as if death would make him noble. Orhan denied him that gift. He ordered him bound. Şahanshah had not drawn his sword. He stood frozen, face pale, watching the collapse of the room that had promised him a throne. Orhan seized him by the collar and threw him to his knees before Orhan. Şahanshah tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to say that he had only listened, that he had not yet sworn fully, that he had been misled. Orhan looked at him with a sadness colder than anger and said that men were not destroyed only by the oaths they took, but by the rooms they chose to enter. Faladios, meanwhile, had moved toward the side exit during the fighting. Of course he had. But this time the side exit opened not to freedom but to Shamel's archers. He stopped when he saw them, then turned slowly back toward Orhan. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes still shone with calculation. Orhan walked toward him through the wreckage of the hall. Around them fighting died down. One by one blades lowered. The conspirators were dead, captured, or disarmed. Rain blew through the open doorway. Firelight flickered across broken maps. Faladios stood alone at last, no corridor behind him, no boat waiting below, no hidden chamber beneath his feet. Still he smiled. He told Orhan that capturing a messenger did not stop the message, that killing a serpent did not empty the nest, that the emperor had more men, more gold, more patience than any border sultan could imagine. Orhan listened until Faladios finished. Then he said that Faladios's mistake had never been underestimating Ottoman strength. His mistake had been underestimating Ottoman memory. Every burned village, every poisoned cup, every dead rider, every mother left waiting beside a wounded son, these things did not vanish. They became debts. And tonight, Orhan had come to collect. Faladios drew his thin blade in one last act of defiance. Orhan did not draw back. Their duel began amid the ruin of the conspiracy, slower than the forest duel, heavier now because both men understood the other. Faladios was wounded, but still fast. He aimed for tendons, joints, the small places armor forgot. Orhan pressed him, cutting off angles, refusing the elegant dance Faladios preferred. Faladios tried to bait him with words, saying that Orhan would one day face a choice he could not escape, that love and empire could not sit on the same throne forever, that every ruler eventually sacrificed the heart or lost the crown. Orhan answered with steel. He caught Faladios's blade, twisted, and forced it aside. Faladios tried to retreat, but his wounded shoulder slowed him. Orhan struck the weapon from his hand. The thin blade spun across the floor and clattered beneath a broken bench. Faladios stumbled, and Orhan seized him by the throat, driving him back against a stone pillar. For the first time, Faladios's smile vanished completely. Orhan leaned close and told him he would not die tonight. Death would be too clean. Faladios would speak. He would name the emperor's agents, the paid lords, the coastal routes, the hidden coin houses, the men inside Samandaria, the men near Bursa, the men who believed shadows could protect them from judgment. Faladios breathed hard, eyes burning with hatred, and whispered that he would say nothing. Orhan's grip tightened slightly, not enough to kill, enough to remind him that breath was a privilege. Then he said that all men spoke eventually. The only question was whether they spoke from fear, pain, pride, or the desire to ruin their friends before their friends ruined them. Faladios, Orhan said, had lived too long among traitors to trust silence. That struck deeper than a blade. Faladios's eyes flickered. Orhan released him and ordered him chained. By dawn, Calavrai belonged to the Ottomans. The captured conspirators were separated, questioned, guarded. Documents were gathered into sealed bundles. Boats in the harbor were secured. Signal fires were extinguished. Orhan rode the inland road to ensure no rider had escaped. Shamil sent messengers in 3 directions, one to Bursa, one to allied tribes, one to the coastal raiding commanders. Yunus sat on a stone step with a bandaged head, watching the sea, his face exhausted but alive. Orhan stood on the highest wall of the old fortress as the sun rose over the water. The storm had passed, leaving the sea iron-gray and restless. Below, Faladios was led in chains across the courtyard, his fine cloak torn, his face pale, his pride wounded more deeply than his shoulder. Andreas cursed from another corner, bound and bleeding. Şahanshah sat under guard, staring at nothing, a man who had seen the throne he desired turn into a cage. Victory again. But not peace. Never peace. Because as Orhan looked east toward the unseen line of Constantinople, he knew the emperor would hear of Calavrai. He would hear that his envoys had been captured, his network exposed, his coastal conspiracy broken. And powerful men did not accept humiliation quietly. They answered it with armies, with gold, with assassins, with alliances, with holy words twisted into banners of war. Turhan climbed the wall and stood beside him. He said that the snake was finally in a jar. Orhan watched Faladios disappear into the lower guardhouse and replied that a snake in a jar still had venom. Shamil joined them moments later, carrying a captured letter sealed with an imperial mark. He said it had been found in Faladios's case, hidden beneath wax and leather. It was written not to Andreas, not to Shahansha, but directly to the emperor. Orhan took it and read. The letter spoke of a final plan if Kalavrai failed, a plan already moving. A fleet not from Karasi but from farther west. Mercenaries hired through merchant houses. A holy relic to be used as a rallying symbol. Border lords promised land if they rose at the right hour. And at the bottom, one sentence written in Faladios's elegant hand. If Orhan cannot be killed by fear, he must be drowned in fronts too many to command. Orhan folded the letter slowly. The next war had already begun before this one ended. He looked down at the courtyard, at the prisoners, at his tired men, at the sea roads beyond the cliffs, and felt the immense weight of the future settle upon him. But he did not bend beneath it. He had been shaped for weight. He had been raised among storms. He had learned that fate did not favor the untouched. It favored those who could burn, bleed, bury, rise, and still choose the road ahead. He turned to Shamil and Turhan and gave the next orders. Faladios would be taken alive to Bursa under heavy guard, not through the main road but through 3 changing routes. Andreas would be held separately. Shahansha would be questioned not with torture first, but with truth, because frightened ambition could sometimes reveal more than pain. The captured documents would be copied and sent to every loyal commander. Coastal defenses would be raised. Spies would be withdrawn from compromised lodges. New routes would be created by men unknown even to the old network. Every bridge, harbor, monastery, and market named in the documents would be watched. Then Orhan looked toward the east again and said that if the emperor wished to drown him in fronts, then Orhan would become the storm that made those fronts drown each other. By midday, the Ottoman force prepared to depart Kalavrai. The fortress behind them was no longer merely a ruin. It had become a captured memory, a place where shadows had been dragged into the rain and forced to show their faces. The prisoners were bound. The wounded were carried. The dead were wrapped. The sea wind moved through broken battlements, carrying away the smoke of the night's violence. And as Orhan mounted Karanlik, as Turhan tightened his saddle, as Shamil sent the last riders out with coded messages, Faladios was brought past in chains. For a moment he and Orhan faced one another. Faladios looked diminished but not defeated in spirit, and that made him more dangerous than a broken man. He said nothing. Orhan said nothing. Between them passed the understanding that this was not finished, that captivity was only another room in the same war, that words spoken in Bursa might cut deeper than swords drawn in Kalavrai. Then the column moved. They rode away from the headland under a sky clearing at last, carrying prisoners, secrets, wounds, and the terrible knowledge that the enemy's reach extended farther than any of them had hoped. Behind them, waves struck the cliffs again and again, erasing blood from the rocks below but not from history. Ahead lay Bursa, where Nilüfer, Esporça, and Malhatan waited behind guarded walls, where joy at Darsan's rescue would mingle with fear at the scale of the revealed conspiracy, where the captured serpent would begin to whisper in chains. And beyond Bursa, beyond the hills, beyond the sea, the emperor would soon receive news that would turn his humiliation into wrath. The night fires had been survived. The forest knives had been broken. The fortress trap had been reversed. But now the true war widened, no longer a hunt for traitors alone, no longer a rescue beneath stone corridors, but a struggle for the soul of the frontier itself. And Orhan Sahib rode at its center, carrying in his silence the names of the living, the dead, the betrayed, and the loyal, knowing that every victory bought him not rest, but the right to face the next storm standing.